Chapter 431. The climax can't come so quickly. It will be at least 30 chapters or so. I'm also looking forward to it. When the time comes, I might have to write slowly. I haven't written such an awesome scene yet. P.S. After watching it for a year, I finally bravely jumped into the stock market and found that it really was a big scene. I couldn't calm down before 3 o'clock. I bought 20,000 and was going to leave it there. I'm a big shot. Ever since his rebirth, or more accurately, ever since he had come from Danzhou to Jingdo, Fan Xian sat in a black carriage, wore a black robe, and held a black, slender dagger as he walked in the darkness. His entire body from the inside out was completely black. Now, on the vast blue sea, the ship was pure. The mast rose high, and the white sail was like the clean wings of a giant bird. It was as if it wanted to pierce through the white clouds on the horizon. The cripple, Lieutenant Dan, had once tied himself to the head of the mast and bitterly cursed the unfairness of the world toward the sky full of rain and shocking waves. However, Fan Xian, who was climbing to the top of the highest mast, did not feel this way. After comparing Chun Pingping to his good friend Dagon, he narrowed his eyes slightly in a thin white robe and faced the morning sea. His thoughts and state of mind became as pure and happy as the scenery around him. Cursing heaven and earth, blaming heaven and earth, fighting with heaven and earth, and wanting to become a person was not the life that the selfish and death-fearing Fan Xian hoped for. He just greedily enjoyed every moment after his rebirth. He wanted wealth, beautiful women, shocking authority, and the occasional spiritual enjoyment when he was alone. After leaving Danzhou, although there were many joyful things to play with, he was busy scheming and scheming all day long, busy killing people and guarding against being killed. This kind of complete relaxation and emptiness was something he hadn't enjoyed in a long time. Without question, Fan Xian was the first little bourgeois in the Qing kingdom. His mother was clearly on Paul's side. Thus, he would not pass up such a petty bourgeois opportunity to go out to sea and enjoy the wind. He would drink good wine and eat beef like Chu Youxiang and be the master of the ship like Master Su. It was a pity that there were not many beauties wearing bikinis on the ship. The ship broke through the waves and left a thin white mark on the blue sea. It brushed past the red sun that seemed to be close at hand. On the mast, the young man's hands danced, his feet danced, and his mouth sang. He was truly like a monkey. The morning sea breeze was actually a bit cold. After Fan Xian shouted a few times, the wind blew through the corners of his shirt until it was cold and wet. He felt uncomfortable all over. Although he was immune to heat and cold with his internal energy cultivation, this kind of wet feeling was still uncomfortable. Only then did he realize that there was always a price to pay for acting cool. Somewhat resentfully, he prepared to go down to the deck. He still couldn't resist glancing greedily at the seemingly endless sea again. His heart was filled with some unknown desire. To be filled. This kind of desire had appeared in his heart since last year, but he had never been able to accurately grasp what it was. He had once discussed it with Haidang, but he had no way of digging it out from his heart. The open sea outside the ship and his heart, which could never be completely relaxed, formed a very awkward feeling. He furrowed his brows and spat. The spittle drew an arc and fell far into the sea. It added a bit of foam and pollution to the sea. The Navy soldiers and Overwatch Council people on the deck below raised their heads to watch this scene. These few days, they had already gotten used to the Imperial envoy's occasional crazed actions. Although many people were not used to the fact that an immortal of poetry and a powerful official had suddenly become a monkey standing at the top of the mast and looking into the distance, they thought that as long as it was a talent, they would always have strange habits that stood out from masses. So they understood. Fan Xian's action of spitting fell into the eyes of many people on the deck. A sailor couldn't resist sighing in admiration. Even spitting is so handsome. Oh. A strange cry came from the top of the mast. I am Mount Tai. I am Mount Tai. Everyone on the deck looked at each other. The sailor who had sucked up earlier was indeed braver than the average person. He gathered his courage and asked the Overwatch Council official beside him, "Sir, what kind of mountain is Mount Tai?" The person he asked was Fan Xian's trusted aide, Hong Changqing. Hong Changqing glanced at him coldly and then turned his face away. A gust of wind rose. With a light snap, a pair of bare feet landed firmly on the deck. A young man wearing a white, unlined garment loosened a rope in his hand and yawned. A sailor beside him rushed over to tie the rope back in place. Fan Xian jumped down from the top of the mast. Although they had seen this scene many times, many people on the deck still couldn't help but be dumbfounded. How high was this mast? How could Sir Fan Jr. jump down so easily? Hong Changqing's gaze as he looked at Fan Xian was full of worship. Everyone knew that Sir Fan Jr. was a rare ace in the world, but they could not imagine that a true ace was actually this powerful. Someone brought the reclining chair over. Fan Xian lay down on it, as if all the bones in his body had gone soft. His 2 feet were propped up on the railing of the ship, allowing the sea breeze to wash his feet. He felt the sea breeze pass through his toes like a lover's gentle caress. He sighed in satisfaction. His left hand held a cup of wine produced by the palace treasury and slowly drank. His right hand gently pinched the shell of a nut and brought it to his lips. Fan Xian once again felt the same regret he had on the mast. If only Warner and Cece were by his side. Sir, Hong Changqing stood by his side. He wanted to say something, but then stopped. In the end, he couldn't resist asking in a low voice, "What kind of mountain is Mount Tai?" In this world, there were many famous mountain peaks, but no one had ever heard of Mount Tai. Hong Changqing quietly said, "Is it tonight's secret order?" Fan Xian paused and couldn't resist laughing. He scolded, "What Mount Tai? There is one on Dong Mountain." Suddenly, a sailor on the ship cried out loudly with a glimmer of excitement in his voice, "We've arrived at Dong Mountain." Fan Xian immediately rose and walked with the excited Overwatch Council officials to the port side of the ship, waiting for the appearance of Dong Mountain. In that instant, Fan Xian, for no reason, remembered that in his previous life, before he had gotten sick, he had taken a ship past the 3 gorges and was about to pass by Goddess Peak. Those passengers had also been this excited. However, that time, Goddess Peak was hidden in the clouds and rain of Wu Mountain. They had only seen the movement of the tent, but not the goddess's body. It was a pity. Fortunately, the weather was clear and there was not a speck of dust in the air. Dong Mountain did not hide his appearance. The ship sailed north for several miles, circling around a beach densely covered with submerged reefs. After making a turn to the left with great difficulty, everyone on the ship suddenly felt their eyes brighten. The ordinary scenery that they had been seeing for several days suddenly disappeared. Instead, a huge mountain that seemed to suddenly stretch across the heaven and earth filled everyone's eyes just like that. The Great Dong Mountain. This was a stone mountain. It seemed normal, but this stone mountain was very large. No one knew how many meters tall it was. Furthermore, the side facing the sea was an incomparably smooth stone wall. There was not a single crack on the stone wall. It was as smooth as jade. It was as if a god had once used a divine sword to split this mountain in the middle. Fan Xian looked at this scene and sucked in a cold breath. Given his eyesight, he judged that this mountain was at least 2,000 meters tall. How could this stone cliff facing the sea be completely unbroken? Although he was a pig when it came to geology, he knew that this kind of marvel was very rare to see. The Great Dong Mountain was not large. It was just tall and steep. It was like a stone pillar, an incomparably large stone pillar. Furthermore, the side facing the sea was already smooth. The erosion of the sea wind for tens of thousands of years had not caused it to show any signs of loosening. There were no signs of animal activity. Even those proud and untamed giant birds could not make their nests on it. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and thought to himself that this place was indeed wondrous. It was even more beautiful than northern Xi's Xi Mountain stone wall. On the side of the Great Dong Mountain, facing the sea, there seemed to be a lot of fertile soil. Verdant and lush forests grew and flourished on that side of the mountain, creating an exuberant and dense appearance of green. One side was green, the other was white. The 2 sides of the Great Dong Mountain used these completely different colors to decorate the world. It formed a very harmonious feeling. It was like a piece of jade that had turned from green to pale. It was extremely beautiful. Fan Xian couldn't resist sucking in another cold breath. Of course, he knew the Great Dong Mountain. In this world, there were two places known as Dong Mountain. One was in the western suburbs of the Kingdom of Qing. It was just a small hill, but because the Qing temple had a shrine there, and because some folk gods enjoyed worship there, it was somewhat famous. The other place was on the shores of the East Sea, the Great Dong Mountain that enjoyed great fame in the world. The Great Dong Mountain was famous because of its wondrous structure and perfect scenery. It also produced the most perfect jade in the world. Fan Xian still remembered that a year ago, during the Northern Qi Empress Dowager's birthday, someone had offered a tribute of the Great Dong Mountain's essence jade. However, after the Qing kingdom had conquered this area during the Northern Expedition, they had built another Qing temple on the Great Dong Mountain and strictly prohibited the mining of jade. Thus, the jade of Dong Mountain was only in stock on the market, and the price was becoming more and more expensive. The third reason for the Great Dong Mountain's fame was the Qing Emperor's edict. The incense in the Qing temple on the Great Dong Mountain had long surpassed that of the Qing temple in Jingdou. One reason was that the Qing temple in Jingdou was strictly guarded. Commoners did not dare go there, while the Qing temple on the Great Dong Mountain did not have this problem. The second reason was that legend said that the Qing temple on the Great Dong Mountain was truly wondrous. Many commoners who had no money to see a doctor would receive the protection of the temple after they went up the mountain to pray. Of the two Dong Mountains, the one by the sea was larger, more famous, and more wondrous. Thus, everyone knew the mountain in front of them as the Great Dong Mountain and the mountain near Jingdou as the Little Dong Mountain. Although Fan Xian had been a materialist in his previous life, he was a staunch idealist in this one. Looking at the stone wall of the Great Dong Mountain, he couldn't help but narrow his eyes. Once again, the same feeling he had when he first entered the Qing temple surged. Was there truly a mysterious power in this world watching him? Was it the temple? He unconsciously shook his head. He could faintly see the mountain paths passing through the woods on the other side of the Great Dong Mountain. They were like thin threads tying the thick layer of green clothing securely to the Great Dong Mountain's naked body. Fan Xian's eyesight was very good, so he could see that at the peak of the mountain, there was a black temple facing indifferently toward the sea below the cliff and the morning sun in front of it. He unconsciously smiled and wondered if he would have to practice climbing from this stone wall again in the future. The difficulty was a bit too high. Before long, the Great Dong Mountain was left behind the boat. It was also left behind the heads of the people on the boat. Other than a few words of praise, no one said anything else and returned to their respective posts. Hong Changqing noticed that the imperial envoy seemed to be quieter than before. He just sat in the reclining chair in a daze. For a lively monkey to suddenly turn back into a thinking monkey, something must have happened. However, Hong Changqing didn't dare ask. He just stood obediently behind Fan Xian, handing over wine and fruits and snacks at any time. "When will we reach Danzhou?" Fan Xian suddenly asked. Hong Changqing paused and went to ask the Navy officer. He came back and replied, "In the afternoon." Fan Xian nodded and suddenly sighed. Hong Changqing thought for a bit and hesitantly asked, "Why are you sighing?" This time, it was Fan Xian's turn to be surprised. He was silent for a long time and didn't reply. He had discovered a somewhat amusing, yet not very amusing, truth. Those who followed him, regardless of whether it was Wang Qinian at the beginning or Deng Ziyu and Su Wenmao later, after following him for a long time, they all seemed to develop in the direction of supporting him, although not everyone had Lao Wang's talent. For example, this sentence, "Why are you sighing?" was it very similar to the sentence, "Why are you smiling?" Fan Xian forced a smile. Only now did he understand the root of this matter. The reason these trusted subordinates joined in was not because of anything else. It was because he was the master. Whether intentionally or not, they would always flatter him, make him happy, and help him solve his worries. Thinking about it, it seemed that it was only Xiaoyan's temperament that was different from normal people. Fan Xian smiled and followed Hong Changqing's words and said, It is human nature to feel shy when one is close to home. He had lived in Danjo for 16 years and left for more than 2. Suddenly returning home always made him feel strange emotions. He didn't know if his grandmother's health was good, if the servant girls in the manor had married, or if the little yellow flowers on the cliff were still faintly blooming. After he left, would there still be anyone standing on the roof yelling that it was raining to collect clothes? Had the hedonistic enemy he had dreamed of since he was young appeared? Dong, how is your tofu selling? Hong Changqing chuckled, but didn't know what the commissioner was afraid of. He thought, you are already an important official of the court, and returning home with the identity of an imperial envoy. You should be bringing honor to your ancestors and traveling in silk clothes every day. You should be incomparably happy. Why are you still so worried? Fanxian glanced at him and asked, your hometown is in Xuanzhou? Yes, I was born and raised there. Find an opportunity to go back and take a look. Yes. The two of them had different statuses, so they didn't have much to talk about. Fanxian was silent for a moment and then said, after you come ashore, immediately go get the council reports for the past few days. Hearing that official matters had been brought up, Hong Changqing's expression became solemn. In a heavy voice, he replied, yes. In that instant, Fanxian had already ended a few days of traveling up Xiaoyao Lake and returned to the role he was supposed to play. He once again hid that monkey-like self. His thin lips were slightly pressed together. There was no excess expression on his handsome face. Send an order to Jiangnan, so continue with the methods, but don't overdo it. Everything can wait until I return from Jingdo after the new year. Yes, you stay by my side. Have the 7 people from Jiaozhou go to Jiangnan and help Deng Ziyu. Yes. The 8 Overwatch Council officials who had revealed themselves in the Jiaozhou incident were all taken away by Fanxian. Because the methods used to deal with the Jiaozhou incident were rather crude and the military had not been purged, Fanxian did not want his subordinates to bear this kind of risk. The nephew of the old Qin family had already taken over the Jiaozhou Navy. As for how to deal with the 1,000 or so soldiers who had participated in the incident and how to purge them without causing a large commotion, that was something the old Qin family needed to consider. Fanxian did not need to worry about it anymore. He was only worried about his student, Ho Jichong. Concerning the matter of the Jiaozhou Navy smuggling, Jichong had put in a great deal of effort. The problem was that Fanxian still had to keep him in Jiaozhou. After the new year, when the court's order of commendation arrived, Jichong would certainly be promoted. Furthermore, Wu Gufei was in Jiaozhou. That clever person should know how to deal with it. As for Su Maokai, Fanxian smiled slightly. Just let him continue to be buried. Perhaps one day he would be useful. Seeing that the commissioner had sunk back in a deep thought, Hong Changqing did not dare disturb him. He waited quietly to the side. Fanxian suddenly opened his mouth and asked, are you in a hurry to wipe out the Ming family? Ever since Hong Changqing had survived on the little island, he had always sunk into nightmares of similar scenes. Suddenly hearing the commissioner speak of his deeply hidden thoughts, his expression became fearful. He knelt down and said, I do not dare to disturb your plans. Fanxian smiled slightly and said, the Ming family, they won't be jumping around for much longer. Going to Jiangnan had taken a lot of time and effort. Although it looked like the Ming family was still struggling at death's door, Fanxian knew that after paying such a large price, he had long put a rope around the Ming family, just like the one Ming Qingda had around his mother's neck. The old Ming matriarch was dead. That rope only needed to be tightened a bit. The Ming family was also dead. It just needed to be tightened when Fanxian had the time. Ming Qingsheng, the 4th master, Zhao Shang, the palace treasury. Fanxian was very satisfied with his results. In the afternoon, the large ship circled a bay that looked like a silver beach. In the distance, they could see a not-so-busy harbor. Seagulls flew up and down around the harbor. Under the light of the setting sun in the distance, the surface of the sea rose and fell slightly like golden waves. Under the golden waves, there was a hidden flow of jade. It should be a school of fish. Hong Changqing looked at the seagulls and couldn't help but furrow his brows in disgust. Fanxian stood up and looked at the officials at the harbor ready to welcome him. He looked at the Black Knights who had already arrived in Danjo ahead of time and were ready to welcome him. He couldn't resist smiling. He had arrived in Danjo. His life on the sea had ended. In this moment, Fan Xian felt a twofold nostalgia and a twofold sigh. To be continued. If you want to know what happened after, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 432. The boat with the white sail was slowly moving along the undulating curve of the bay. There was already a small boat coming from the direction of Danjo Harbor. The small boat moved very quickly. In a moment, it drew close to the large boat. The man on the boat made a hand signal, and the two boats slowly moved closer to each other. The rope ladder was lowered. An official with a head full of sweat panted as he climbed up. At this time, Fan Xian had already changed into normal clothes and was putting on shoes. He didn't have time to say anything. He nodded his head and indicated for the official to speak. The official wiped the sweat from his forehead and said in a trembling voice, "I am the Dianli of Danjo. I have come to welcome the imperial envoy on his return to his hometown." Hearing these words, Fan Xian paused. Earlier, he hadn't noticed the official's robes. Hearing him say he was a Dianli, he couldn't help but be surprised. He was not a person who liked to be flattered and flattered, but he knew that the commissioner of the Overwatch Council, the imperial envoy, returning to his hometown, the local officials in Danjo would certainly feel honored and would do everything they could to flatter him. Why had the Zhizhou not come, but a Dianli had come? He unconsciously glanced at the ant-like people on the dock in the distance and narrowed his eyes. Where is the Zhizhou? However, this unintentional sentence landed in the Danjo Dianli's ears like a clap of thunder. He was given quite a fright. With a mournful face, he said, "Sir received news of your arrival. At this time, he should be hurrying to the dock to welcome you. Sir, don't blame him. It is truly, Sir did not know you would arrive so early." This string of "sir" confused Fan Xian. After thinking for a while, he finally understood that Danjo had not expected his boat to arrive so quickly. He smiled and said, "What is there to blame? It is only a private return. There is no need for such a grand welcome." However, there was already a grand procession on the dock. Fan Xian's eyesight was startling. He could faintly see people hurriedly preparing to put up awnings. There were also officials hurrying in that direction. There were also many Danjo commoners gathered there. The Danjo Dianli felt slightly more at ease. He braced himself and raised his head slightly, sizing up this major figure who had not returned to Danjo for 2 years. He had only been transferred to Danjo after Fan Xian left, so he had heard many rumors about the strange young master in the Count's manor. In officialdom, he had also heard many of Sir Fan Jr.'s glorious achievements in Jingdo and under heaven. Thus, he had long been filled with curiosity toward this figure who had walked out of Danjo. As expected, a heavenly figure. The Dianli was shocked by Fan Xian's appearance and immediately lowered his head to report the day's situation. It turned out that Lin Wanner, the princess, had brought the third prince and a group of people back to Danjo. This had long startled the entire city. Ever since Danjo's seaport business had declined, it had long become a small, secluded place. Although the emperor had reduced taxes year after year, and the people were happy who had seen such a large scene. This was a prince and princess. Everyone was guessing that since his wife and student had returned, Sir Fan Jr. would also return. Thus, they had long made preparations. However, they had not expected that Fan Xian would be handling matters in Jiaozhou. All of the officials and commoners did not know when Fan Xian would arrive, so they gradually relaxed. It was not until today that a group of completely black riders suddenly arrived outside the city. They passed through the city defenses and came directly to the docks to set up defenses. Only then did the commoners guess that Sir Fan Jr. would arrive today. Time was too tight, so only the Dianli, who had coincidentally heard of this matter, had rushed over. The Danjo Zhizhou and other officials were probably still in their manners, avoiding the summer heat. At this moment, they were hurriedly putting on their clothes and rushing over. The Danzhou Jinli was afraid that the government would not be able to set up in time and cause Fan Xian, this major figure, to become angry, so he had quickly come up on a small boat to ask for forgiveness. He carefully looked at Fan Xian's expression. Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and asked, "Is the old lady well?" The Jinli smiled flatteringly and said, "Her body is very healthy. The Zhizhou often comes into the manor to pay his respects." Fan Xian suddenly furrowed his brows. The Jinli's heart jumped. He thought that Fan Xian was beginning to express dissatisfaction with today's work. He was so scared that the sweat on his back increased. It was Hong Changqing beside Fan Xian who knew that he was suddenly confused and didn't know how to refer to his wife in front of this official. He smiled slightly and said in a quiet voice, "Is the mistress here?" Fan Xian let out a breath and nodded. Although the Jinli in front of him was a minor official, there was no reason for him to refer to Wanner as mistress, even though this Jinli would certainly be very willing to recognize Lin Wanner as his grandmother. "Madam is in the manor," the Jinli carefully said. "The old lady is also in the manor. The weather is hot today. I was afraid that the old lady would be worried about you and insist on coming to the docks to receive you, so I didn't dare report to the manor." Fan Xian nodded his head with satisfaction and patted the Jinli's shoulder with approval. He also had the same intentions, so he didn't have the Black Knights report to the manor. He had even prepared to give the old lady and some people in the city a surprise. The Jinli was overwhelmed by the favor. "Have the people on the docks disperse," Fan Xian smiled and said. "Lend me your little boat. I'll go back myself in a bit." Since the old lady and Wanner had not come to the docks, he couldn't be bothered to interact with those officials and his fellow villagers in Danzhou. It would not be too late to gossip about them in the future. He sat in the bamboo shed with a serious expression. That time in Suzhou was enough for such an uncomfortable experience. Unexpectedly, hearing these words, Hong Changqing and the Jinli said in unison, "That cannot be done." Hong Changqing was worried about Fan Xian's safety. After Fan Xian calmed down slightly, he smiled slightly and said, "Qinghua, you haven't been with me for long. In the future, remember, you are a member of the Overwatch Council. As for my decisions, just accept them. I can't get rid of those tiger guards the Emperor gave me. Do you still want to pester me and make it hard for me to relax?" Although the words were light, the meaning was heavy. Hong Changqing laughed bitterly and didn't say anything more. The Danzhou Jinli said with a pained expression, "Sir, this side looks like the beach is flat, but behind it is all precipitous cliffs and precipices. There is nowhere to go. We can only go ashore from the docks. If you want to travel the mountains, it's best to wait for another day." Fan Xian stood up and tightened the clothes on his body. Looking at the precipices that slowly passed behind the boat and the rocks that couldn't be more familiar, he couldn't help but sigh with satisfaction and say, "Sir, Ji grew up in Danzhou. Do you still not know the way home?" Danzhou was not large. In these decades, it had produced a minister of revenue and an emperor's wet nurse. That was already glorious enough. Now, it had another imperial envoy. Furthermore, the imperial envoy had grown up here until he was 16. Thus, during these 2 years, the people of Danzhou had all felt excited and excited. Even when they interacted with the people of neighboring provinces, they had a glimmer of confidence and pride. The Black Knights of the Overwatch Council had come to the docks to set up defenses. Although the people were afraid, they guessed that this major figure was returning home. Naturally, they surrounded him, ready to see if the young master of the Count's manor, who was as pretty as a girl, had changed in appearance during these 2 years in Jingdou. A nanny holding a basket with eggs muttered, "After the new year, he said he was coming back." In the end, it wasn't the real person who came back. This time, it should be the real person, right? A person beside her smiled and said, "How could it not be the real person? Don't you see that the third prince and Lady Fan have both returned?" Another person said excitedly, "I wonder if young Master Fan's appearance has changed? When he went to Jingdou, who knows how many young ladies in Danzhou cried until their eyes were swollen." The Annie laughed loudly and said, "How could he change just like that? I don't think so. Even his own father can change just like that." Immediately, this unknown person was dragged by the excited crowd into an alleyway to be violently beaten. After a moment of awkwardness and silence, the Danjo commoners waiting for Fan Xian on the docks gradually turned the topic of idle conversation back to Fan Xian himself and old stories from the past. Do you still remember every time there was a tornado, young Master Fan liked to stand on the roof of his courtyard and yell for everyone to collect the clothes? Everyone laughed. The young people close to Fan Xian's age couldn't help but think of many things from the past. At that time, Fan Xian was only an illegitimate child of the Count's manor. Occasionally, he would fool around with these children on the streets. However, as he gradually grew older and his status changed, he had long become a person of two different worlds. There was only envy and some complicated emotions in the eyes of the young man. One of them said in a small voice, "I've also heard the Imperial Envoy tell stories." His voice was very quiet, and no one probably believed the content of his words, so most people unconsciously let their ears filter these words. Seeing that no one paid attention to him, the young man said with vexation, "It's true. I still remember it was a story about digging for treasure." Still, no one paid attention to him. The Annie holding the egg said with great interest, "Speaking of which, our young Master Fan is truly different from other people. Ever since he was young, he's been obedient and sensible. There are also a few strange things. For example, when he and the serving girls in the Count's manor go out on the streets, when did he ever let them carry anything? TSK, this master is what you call amiable." The discussions on the docks were lively and varied. In a short while, the Danjo Zhizhou arrived with the officials. They were panting as they tidied up their official robes. Looking at the large ship with white sails that was about to dock, they let out a breath in their hearts. They thought to themselves that after so much hurrying, they had finally arrived. However, no one had expected that the Imperial Envoy would not be on the ship. The Danjo gently walked down the ladder and met the Zhizhou's murderous gaze. With a long face, he said, "Sir came down halfway. He should have already returned to the manor by now." The Zhizhou was shocked and glared at him. He was anxious to go to the Count's manor, but he did not dare to leave. Although the Imperial Envoy had come down, there was still a group of officials on the ship that he had to attend to. In front of these trusted aides of Fan Xian, he did not dare to be too arrogant. Hearing these words, the surrounding crowd couldn't help but cry out in unison. Shortly after, they let out long sighs. Their tone was full of pity. Hong Changqing wore the Overwatch Council's official robes and led a group of Overwatch Council secret agents off the ship. He looked at the crowd on the docks. The crowd was swept by this cold gaze and immediately shut their mouths. Unexpectedly, Hong Changqing piled a warm smile and said, "The commissioner's heart aches for everyone being sunburned on the docks, so he thought of this last resort. In the future, he will naturally come out to meet everyone." He then turned to greet the Zhizhou and warmly said, "Sir truly does not want to startle the place, so we appreciate your kindness. However, please take everyone back first." On a precipitous cliff not far from Danjo, there was a white figure struggling to climb up. Perhaps the word struggle was not the right word to use, because the person who was just a small white dot compared to the stone wall climbed up very easily. The tip of his toes pushed slightly, his fingers slightly bent, his whole body sticking to the slippery stone wall, moving forward like a flowing curve. It did not seem to be the slightest bit strenuous. This person seemed to be exceptionally familiar with the stone walls filled with bird nests and moss. The path he chose was also incomparably precise. Even when he placed his hands and feet, there was not the slightest hesitation. It was as if he knew where the protrusions under the rocks were, and where the cracks were where he could land his feet. Without further explanation, this person was Fan Xian, who had left the large white sail ship. When he was a child, he began to climb the cliff under Wu Zhu's supervision until he was 16. He had spent a full 10 years on this cliff. Of course, he was as familiar with every blade of grass and tree as his own palm print. It had been more than 2 years since he had climbed. Fan Xian calmed his breathing and got close to the stone cliff he had not seen in a long time, the seabirds and mud he had not seen in a long time, and climbed upward. Before long, he was already standing on the highest cliff. looking down at the waves crashing against the rocks below his feet and the view of Danjo in the distance. He turned around and, with some surprise, saw a large cluster of small yellow flowers blooming. Other than the flowers being a bit more luxuriant, everything on the top of the cliff seemed to have not changed in the slightest from 2 years ago. Fan Xian sighed and sat down. His 2 feet swayed on the edge of the precipice. A faint worry and longing rose in his heart. Uncle Wu Zhu was not here. After I finished writing yesterday, I was happy again. At night, I was preparing to read the reviews carefully when I suddenly found that there were fewer reviews than usual. I was confused. I scratched my head and thought, is my honey really someone else's potassium cyanide? Only after asking did I find out it was in the new edition. The reviews on both sides are a mess. Do I have to run to both sides? P.S. I bought 20,000 yuan. Where would I have the money to buy 20,000 shares? I don't care about being awesome. In any case, my state of mind is excellent. I'm not afraid at all. Friends, don't push for shares. I sincerely thank you. I'm a rookie. My eyes are dazzled and my heart is dazzled. I don't have the money. I continue to scratch my head and let the dandruff fly. P.S. Today is the Lunar New Year. The whole world is celebrating. I hope the festival will become more and more beautiful. Also, my apologies. I will write the part about returning to Danjo in great detail, so progress may be slow. I personally value this part. Above. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 433. The sea breeze blew against Fan Xian's face, waking him from his thoughts. Sitting silently on this precipitous cliff, he ran through all the stories of his rebirth in his mind. This was not only because he thought of Uncle Wu Zhu, but also because this familiar cliff top made him feel something. Many years ago, it was on this cliff that Fan Xian, as a young boy, made his 3 wishes in front of Wu Zhu. To have many, many children, to write many, many books, to live a very, very good life. Uncle Wu Zhu concluded that Fan Xian needed many, many women, many gunmen, and many servants. Thus, he needed a lot of money, which was power. Thus, the 2 of them went to Jingdo. To this day, in Fan Xian's second life, he had already had many experiences with the opposite sex. Although not much remained, he had no children. However, he was not in a hurry. He didn't hire gunmen, but he was almost at the end of Dream of the Red Chamber. Copying poems in front of the palace. Copying poems when he met beautiful women. Without question, he had grown into the world's greatest gunman. As for money and power, Fan Xian had also obtained a lot, but a very, very good life? He furrowed his brows and shook his head. People were never satisfied. Recalling and concluding did not take him too long. After confirming that Uncle Wu Zhu was not on the cliff, he decisively rolled up his trousers and followed the familiar stone path between the cliffs, sweeping down like a bird. The reason he had returned to Danjo and was not in a hurry to see his grandmother, instead coming to the cliff, was because Fan Xian had long been worried about Wu Zhu. Although in the past half year, he had not revealed a glimmer of anxiety in front of or behind others. Of course, not many people knew of Wu Zhu's existence. In the depths of his heart, he was very worried. One day before he left Jingdo, in front of the Overwatch Council's frozen mirror-like pool, Chen Pingping told him the news of Wu Zhu's injury. In this world, the number of people who could injure Wu Zhu could be counted on one hand. In the battle with Ku He that no one knew about last summer, Uncle Wu Zhu and Ku he had separately recovered for many months. This time, how long would Uncle Wu Zhu need to recover? Originally, Fan Xian was already used to the blind uncle's mysterious appearance, but when he thought of Wu Zhu's strange injury this time, he still couldn't stop worrying. He always felt that things were not so simple. The lack of news for half a year made him even more angry. So, as soon as he returned to Danjo, he tried to find traces of Wu Zhu. However, Uncle Wu Zhu was not here, and he did not know how his injury was. Taking advantage of the dusk, Fan Xian quietly walked alone into Danzhou, the place he had grown up in. He greedily breathed in the slightly salty and damp air. His mood brightened and did not become salty and damp. Walking past the city gate, the cloth shop, and the wine shop, the sky was dark. No one noticed that this young man was the imperial envoy that the people of Danzhou had been eagerly waiting for. He walked all the way until he arrived outside the shop. Fan Xian closed his eyes and listened. He then turned into a side alley. Stepping on the moss that had not been imprinted on his footsteps for a long time, he fished out a metal key from beside the dusty door and opened the back door. His entire body flashed in. The front and back rooms of the shop were covered in dust. The goods on the shelves had probably long been emptied by thieves. Only the chopping board in the back was still there. The thin knife marks on it seemed to tell the story of a young man chopping radishes. Fan Xian chuckled and went forward to pick up the kitchen knife beside the chopping board. He gestured a few times. This kitchen knife had been gifted to him by Uncle Wu Zhu. Uncle Wu Zhu never left marks on the chopping board when he chopped radishes. Later on, he had managed to do it with some difficulty. The taste of the radishes and sorghum was not bad. Without wasting too much time, when Fan Xian stood in front of the door to his own count's manor, the sun had not completely set below the mountain behind him. The warm light still shone inside and outside the incomparably lively count's manor. Today was a big day for the imperial envoy to visit his hometown and relatives, so the servants in the count's manor were all busy, excited and proud. Everyone's faces were like the two large red lanterns hanging at the manor's entrance, glowing with red light and high-spirited. The officials in Danzhou begged for an audience, but had no door. They had long been politely asked to leave. The people passing through the manor door were all the servants and housekeepers of the manor. Fan Xian stood with a smile at the door and looked at those familiar faces. He didn't know what he was thinking. There were a few unfamiliar faces that had probably only been summoned into the manor in recent years. "Young man, don't stand at the entrance." However, his tone was not very fierce. Under the care of the old ancestor, the count's manor had always been very strict. There were very few cases of bullying the good and suppressing the kind. Fan Xian smiled bitterly and opened his mouth. Before he had time to say anything, he heard a figure passing through the manor scream. Ah! The person who screamed was a young servant girl. Her face was flushed, and her eyes were shining as she stared at Fan Xian outside the door. She ran out in small steps, almost tripping over the high threshold. Fan Xian was so frightened that he hurriedly held her up. The little servant girl broke free of Fan Xian's hand like she had been electrocuted. Her hands twisted as she looked at Fan Xian. She was so excited that she couldn't speak. The housekeeper outside the door was curious. A few old people finally saw Fan Xian's appearance clearly in the dusky light, and also let out a cry. The little servant girl finally came to her senses. Her face was bright red. Toward the courtyard, she cried out in a sharp voice, "The young master is back." "What? The young master is back. Quickly go inform the old madam." "Young master." Following the spread of this news, the already joyous atmosphere in the count's manor immediately exploded. A wave of footsteps moved in this direction. No one knew how many people were coming to welcome Fan Xian home. At this moment, Fan Xian, led by the little serving girl and carefully escorted by the various stewards in the door, walked into the manor. Fan Xian looked at the terrified man behind him and laughingly scolded, "Do you think I don't know how to walk? You can go back." Those people sighed and unwillingly retreated. Fan Xian looked at the little servant girl beside him and thought she looked familiar, but he couldn't match her name. He couldn't resist smiling and asking, "What is your name? Are little Qing and little Ya all right?" The little servant girl immediately became sad. She thought to herself, the young master has been away for less than 2 years. How could he have forgotten her name? She had heard from her sisters that the young master had been a good master who loved his servant girls since he was young. He was the most gentle and polite. She couldn't resist glancing at Fan Xian with hidden bitterness and said, "Young master, Sister Qing is already married. Sister Ya is still in the manor. I'm Xiao Hong." "Xiao Hong?" Fan Xian had already been unkindly stared at by the little girl's resentful gaze. Now that he heard her name clearly, he almost fell in fright. He stared at the little girl's delicate face and still didn't believe it. He couldn't resist sighing and saying, "It's only been 2 years. How did you grow so big?" As the saying goes, a girl changes 18 times between childhood and womanhood. When Fan Xian left Anzhou, Xiaohong was still a 12-year-old tea-girl. Now, she had already grown into a big girl. Her figure was already visible, and her features had developed. No wonder Fan Xian didn't recognize her at first. Before the master and servant could exchange feelings, they heard a clamor coming from the west. The chattering was like countless birds swooping in. Fan Xian's eyes were sharp. He saw from a distance that his tiger guards, Hong, Chongqing, and the others had fallen behind. From this, it could be seen how urgent the women lined up in front of the formation were. A wave of fragrance wafted over. The serving girls in the Count's manor stopped not far in front of Fan Xian. They looked at Fan Xian with faces full of joy. They then respectfully bowed. "Greetings to the young master." The servant girls' faces were mostly filled with joy and excitement. Occasionally, there was a trace of sadness from being separated for 2 years. At this time, the housekeeper and servants of the Count's manor also hurried over from the back and knelt down in greeting to Fan Xian. For a moment, the garden was densely packed with over 20 people kneeling. Xiaohong, the servant girl, stood by Fan Xian's side and didn't know what to do. She finally came to her senses and also knelt down. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian pulled on her arm and laughingly scolded the servant girls in front of him who had been with him since childhood. "All of you get up. You didn't do this at home. How come after leaving for 2 years, you all dare to disobey my wishes?" The servant girls giggled and stood up, surrounding Fan Xian's side. Some inquired about his well-being, some brought him tea and water, some held fans to fan him, and naturally, there were also some who took advantage of helping him tidy up his clothes to satisfy the emptiness of not being close to the most beautiful man in the world for 2 years. They all did things, and so on and so forth. Just like this, Fan Xian walked into the back garden with a crowd on his left and right. Fan Xian looked at the tiger guards and Hong Chongqing, who were waiting by the side of the road with strange expressions. He glared at them and thought to himself, "I grew up amidst a pile of rouge, and I still find this kind of life comfortable. What are you men looking at?" He had just entered the back garden when he heard a sentence. What a scandal! The servant girls supporting Fan Xian giggled and let go of his hands. Fan Xian, who had been reveling in the relaxed and happy life he hadn't had in a long time, shuddered. Piling the sincere smile on his face, he looked up the steps. He saw a noble old woman looking at him coldly. Warner was holding the old woman's left hand with a face full of smiles. The third prince was carefully holding the old woman's right hand. Cece was holding a large palm leaf umbrella and hiding behind the old woman. She looked at Fan Xian with a not-quite-there smile, as if telling him it was over for him today. For an old woman to have this kind of status, she could only be the Qing emperor's wet nurse. She had brought up an emperor, a prince, a minister, and taught up a commissioner. She was the Danzhou ancestor and grandmother of the Fan family. Fan Xian looked at the old woman's kind and calm expression. He was very excited. With a strange cry, he threw himself at her. Who would have thought that in the middle of his journey, the old woman had already shouted in a cold voice, "Stop!" Fan Xian was stunned and stood dumbly on the ground. Looking at his grandmother, he didn't know what mistake he had made. The old woman slowly examined her grandson, who had been gone for 2 years. Her gaze gradually moved down from Fan Xian's face. After confirming that the little guy had all 4 limbs and was not disfigured, she nodded her head with satisfaction. However, when her gaze fell below Fan Xian's legs, her gaze still became cold. "Go wash your feet. You're already so old, yet you don't care at all," the old woman scolded sternly. Fan Xian lowered his head and looked at his muddy feet. Only then did he remember that when he climbed the mountain, he had long thrown away his shoes. Involuntarily, he raised his head and said with a bitter and pitiful expression, "Grandmother, wash first." As soon as the words were spoken, The serving girls had already laughed out loud. They brought out a chair for Fan Xian and went to fetch hot water to serve Fan Xian as he washed his feet. Another serving girl entered the room and took out the shoes Fan Xian had worn a few years ago. Tilting her head, she giggled and said, "Young master, I wonder if your feet have grown." Fan Xian allowed them to clean him up with a bitter expression. Seeing Wanner by his grandmother's side reveal an expression that she couldn't help but laugh, he couldn't resist glaring at her. Wanna stuck out her tongue and smiled cutely. Wanna was also curious. Her husband was someone who feared nothing. Why was it that after returning to Danzhou and facing this old woman, he was so scared? After washing his feet and putting on his shoes, Fan Xian leaned against the steps with shifty eyes. The old woman looked at his expression and knew he had no good intentions. Suddenly, she thought of the wild actions he had done the day he left Danzhou and couldn't help but jump in fright. With a serious expression, she scolded, "What does this monkey want to do now?" "Monkey?" To the side, Lin Wanner and the third prince couldn't resist laughing again. Normal men were forbidden from entering the back garden, so the housekeepers and servants, as well as the tiger guards and Hong Chongqing, were all watching the spectacle from outside. Bystanders who heard these words would only think of Fan Xian climbing back and forth on the roof of the fake mountain in the Count's manor, while Hong Chongqing was thinking of the commissioner jumping up and down on a large ship with white sails. They couldn't resist nodding their heads, thinking that the old woman's description was indeed not wrong at all. Fan Xian approached the steps with a mischievous smile on his face. He could hear that his grandmother was putting on a strong front, but feeling weak inside. She pressed forward step by step. The old woman panicked and pointed at Fan Xian. "Just stand there, just stand there. Don't come any closer." As soon as he finished speaking, Fan Xian had already leaped over. The skills of a 9th level ace were indeed not to be trifled with. He hugged the old woman and kissed her hard on the cheek. There was a pop, and the sound of the kiss was audible. Joyous laughter rang out inside and outside the garden. "Grandmother, I missed you so much," Fan Xian said sincerely. He thought of how he had discovered earlier that the wrinkles on his grandmother's face were deeper than 2 years ago and that she had become thinner. For some reason, a faint sense of sorrow welled up in his heart. He helped his grandmother into the room and had her sit in a chair. Only then did he kneel on the ground and formally bow again, giving 3 solid kowtows. "I heard you have a girl in Suzhou." After the grandmother and grandson spoke warmly for a while, the old woman suddenly changed the topic and caught Fan Xian off guard. Fan Xian raised his head in surprise and saw Wanner's face full of confusion. Presumably, she also didn't understand why the old woman had suddenly said that. As for Cece, her face was even more innocent, indicating that she had not said anything to the old woman. To be continued. If you want to know what happened afterwards, please log on to www.cmfu.com. More chapters. Support the author. Support original reading. Chapter 434. Suzhou. Fan Xian chuckled and said to his grandmother, "What girls are you talking about?" "If you're talking about girls, I built a Baiwa brothel in Suzhou. There are a lot of girls there." The old woman shook her head helplessly. "This is another matter. You can be an official, but you have to do this kind of romantic business. Aren't you afraid of losing face?" Fan Xian did not feel it was embarrassing. He smiled merrily and said, "That is the second prince's business. I am just looking after it on his behalf." After he finished speaking, he looked at the third prince, who was sitting next to the old madam. The third prince's little face suddenly showed a look of embarrassment. The Baiwa brothel in the beginning had something to do with this kid. The old woman sighed and said, "Don't keep changing the topic. You know who I'm asking about." Fan Xian fell silent. He knew that his grandmother was asking about Haidang. The matter between him and Haidang had spread throughout the world. His grandmother was not a pure old woman who did not pay attention to outside matters. Of course, she knew the story. However, this matter was problematic. Furthermore, in front of Wanner, he really didn't know what to say. He raised his head and smiled warmly. "Grandmother, don't listen to the rumors outside. Haidang is in Jiangnan and is only helping me handle some matters. The old woman did not believe it and said suspiciously, "Why would a northern Chi person always stay by your side? She is not an ordinary woman." Fan Xian was speechless. He secretly glanced at Wanner and found that his wife's face was calm, but her little hands were gripping the corners of her sleeves. He couldn't resist laughing bitterly and facing his grandmother. He said, "Don't misunderstand. Is it a misunderstanding?" The old woman looked at him with a not-quite-there smile. After all, there were still people in the hall, so it was not good for the old woman to speak directly. She only slowly said, "There are some things that should be done openly. I don't like to be secretive. If it is open and above board, then bring her back to see. If you don't mean it that way, then be careful. After all, although she is not a Qing person, she is still a girl. How can her reputation be ruined by you so carelessly?" Fan Xian smiled bitterly. "Did you hear that?" said the old lady, staring at him. Fan Xian sighed and nodded. He thought to himself, this matter was not a matter of yes or no. His shamelessness had indeed been seen through by his grandmother at a glance. As for Haitang, Lang Tiao had already gone to Suzhou. Given Haitang's personality, she probably would not oppose her own sect. Once she returned to northern Qi, it would be difficult to see her again. There was no need to go into detail about what would happen next. "I said, Grandma," he said with a bitter face, "I haven't been back for 2 years. Why are you scolding me as soon as we meet? Can we talk about it later?" The old lady snorted and said, "You still know that you haven't come back for 2 years." She glared at Fan Xian, and the wrinkles on her face gradually smoothed out. Laughing, she scolded, "You're in no hurry to go home after arriving in Danzhou. What did you run off to earlier? You're already so old, yet you still don't know anything." Fan Xian realized that his grandmother was jealous. He laughed and said, "I got off the boat halfway and went for a walk." Without waiting for his grandmother to speak, he threw her a glance first. The grandmother and granddaughter had lived together for 16 years. How could they not know each other's hidden thoughts? The old woman coughed lightly and said, "It's getting late. Prepare to start the banquet. I still have some things to say to Nji." Finishing these words, she stood shakily and prepared to bow to the third prince in accordance with her duties. The old woman was the wet nurse of the royal family and could be considered a family servant. She paid particular attention to the hierarchy. Lin Wanner was Fan Xian's wife, so, as a grandmother, she did not have to care. However, the third prince was living in the house, so she always maintained etiquette. However, her position was too unique. The third prince had always called himself Fan Xian's student, so how could he accept this ancestor's bow? The child struggled until his face was bright red. He dodged away with all his might and ran out the door like his but was on fire. Fan Xian went forward and gently held Wanner's hand. Leaning close to her ear, he said something. Wanner nodded repeatedly and took Cece out the door as ordered. There was only the old woman and Fan Xian left in the hall. Fan Xian moved over a small stool and sat beside his grandmother. Just like in the past, he listened to the lecture properly. Now that there were no outsiders, the old woman's words were much more direct. "That Haidang, what are you going to do with her?" Fan Xian tilted his head and thought for a while. He furrowed his brows and said seriously, "It will be difficult to marry her. Let's stall for some time first." "Do you want to marry her?" Fan Xian hesitated. He always felt that his relationship with Haidang was still more of a friend. If he married her, that feeling would probably change. "It depends on her. If she wants to marry, then I want to marry her." It's still the same old saying. After all, the Fan family is a large and influential family. How can we let her drift outside alone? The old woman coughed gently. "Since you like her, you will have to marry her." Fan Xian forced a smile. He thought that this matter was not something the Fan family could decide on its own. However, since his grandmother had set the goal, he could only work hard to carry it out. He used his palm to gently pat his grandmother's back and quietly sent a sliver of Tianyi Dao's gentle jinqi in her to help her adjust her body. He was pleased to find that his grandmother's body was not bad. Although she had aged a bit these 2 years, there were no signs of decline. However, even if she marries, there must be a hierarchy, the old woman suddenly said seriously. You can't mistreat Wanner. Originally, I didn't like that girl Haidang. For her to be with you without a title or status, how is that appropriate? Fan Xian was speechless. He knew that he had been busy with official business and had indeed neglected his wife. Furthermore, Wanner appeared calm on the surface, but in the depths of her heart, she was meticulous. To say something cliched, the higher Fan Xian's position was, the more he didn't want Wanner to participate in conspiratorial affairs. It was unavoidable that Wanner would lack a real sense of existence. This kind of feeling was probably not very comfortable. However, it could be seen that Wanner was greatly liked by the old woman these days in Danzhou. Don't bring this matter up. The old woman gazed at the grandson at her knees and sighed. Gently stroking his cheek, she said, "These years in Jingdo probably haven't been easy either. You know about those things, right?" In reality, during the 16 years in Danzhou, Fan Xian and his grandmother had not been overly intimate with each other. Fan Xian knew that it was because his grandmother wanted to raise him into a cold and hard person. Only then would he be able to protect his life in Jingdo. When was the last time his grandmother had been so gentle? It seemed to be when he was still an infant and his grandmother had held him in the little building and cried silently. Fan Xian was slightly absent-minded. It was also because of that night that he knew that other than Uncle Wu Zhu, there was also his grandmother who treated him wholeheartedly. I know all about it. Fan Xian lowered his head. A moment later, he smiled and sighed. The problem of one's birth is always so hard to imagine. The old woman smiled slightly and said, "It's all in the past. I think the emperor still loves you." Fan Xian was silent and didn't reply. His grandmother had raised the Qing emperor. Presumably, deep in her heart, she was proud of this fact. However, it was clear that his grandmother's words did not explain everything. At least, she did not explain what she said on that night 18 years ago. He slowly raised his head and looked at his grandmother's wrinkled face. In a quiet voice, he asked, "Grandmother, my mother, how exactly did she die?" The old woman paused as if she hadn't thought he would ask this question. After a moment of hesitation, she slowly said, "Your father still hasn't told you?" Fan Xian smiled weakly. "Father has said it, but I still feel that it shouldn't be so simple. Your mother is an extraordinary person." The old woman lovingly patted his cheek. "I believe the emperor has already avenged her. As for whether or not there are any enemies left behind, naturally, those boys will take care of it." Those boys were the ones who had fought every day in King Cheng's manor. Fan Xian smiled. It looked like his grandmother didn't know the details. Perhaps she didn't want to tell him her guesses. Speaking of which, it was true. For anyone else, he had already received enough compensation from the royal family. Then, why would he be so fixated on the story of the past? Was there a conclusion? "Sija, what kind of child is he?" the old woman suddenly asked. Fan Xian smiled shortly after. Only now did he remember that ever since his second son was born, he had always lived in Jingdo. He had never even seen his grandmother. He considered his words and slowly said, "Sija." Perhaps in the past he ran amok. Now that he is gradually getting older, he knows when to stop. "Oh, tell me about it." It was clear that the old woman was interested in her only grandson. Fan Xian smiled and told her everything about his dealings with Sija after he entered the capital. He didn't even hide the Baoyue brothel incident. This part of the story made the old woman's expression heavy. Occasionally, she smiled. "You are saying these two children are running a brothel in Jingdo?" The old woman sighed. She thought to herself that she was getting old. No matter what, she couldn't understand the thoughts of these children. But the third prince is so young yet so full of mischief. Thinking of that matter, Fan Xian was filled with anger. He huffed coldly. "The third prince is not just a child." The old woman smiled. "Sija is alone in the north. Is he doing well?" There were often letters from northern Qi, so Fan Xian was well aware of his second brother's life in the north. He comforted her. "Don't worry, I have people there to look after him." The old woman thought for a moment and then said worriedly, "After all, it is a foreign country. If Haidang was still in northern Qi Shanjing, perhaps it would be fine. But right now, There is no one in northern Qi you can trust. It was not convenient for Fan Xian to speak of his secret agreement with the northern Qi emperor. He thought for a moment and then said, "Don't worry, grandmother. Isn't Ruruo also in Shanjing right now? She is Master Ku He's last disciple. The northern Qi court will have to give her some face. With her watching, Xizha won't dare do anything when he does things." It was strange to say that Fan Xian had thought of a way to send his sister and brother to northern Qi these 2 years. Minister Fan vaguely guessed some of his intentions, but did not expose them. The old woman clearly did not think of it there. She only smiled and said, "Speaking of Ruo, I wonder if her body is better." "Much better. There's no more yellow hair on her head." Fan Xian's eyes suddenly turned, and he said, "Grandmother, come back with me to Jingdo this time. Father misses you very much." The old woman was silent for a moment. A moment later, she slowly shook her head. Fan Xian sighed. He didn't understand why grandmother always wanted to live in Danzhou. "Ruo is 17 or 18, the old woman said worriedly. "She hasn't found a husband yet. You broke up her marriage to Hongcheng. Then you have to keep an eye out for people with good character, good family backgrounds, and trustworthy families." Fan Xian patted his chest loudly and said, "Grandmother, you gave this matter to me to handle. I will definitely handle it properly." Truthfully speaking, he did not think this way in his heart. He thought, Ruo is so young. Why is she in such a rush to marry? Seeing more and walking more was the right thing to do. As he thought this, he completely forgot that when he married Warner, the two of them were actually not much older than children. As a brother, you have done very well." The old woman looked at Fan Xian warmly and said with praise. The countess looked at Fan Xian warmly and said with praise, "You have managed it well. The Fan family is blessed. If your brother and sister can become successful, it will all be because of you." Fan Xian's face reddened. He thought to himself, Ruo was so smart that she did not need him to manage her. Xizha's nature had been forcefully twisted by him. In the beginning, it had been for his own benefit. As for his ability, even the shopkeepers of Qingyu Hall had admitted that Xizha was a genius in business. The conversation between grandmother and grandson, which was kept away from others, came to an end. The old woman hesitantly asked, "What about that person? Did he come back this time?" The old woman was asking about the blind shopkeeper who had been their neighbor for 16 years. Fan Xian paused for a moment and then understood. With a pained expression, he said, "I was going to ask grandmother if she had seen him come back recently." Madame Dowager's expression turned serious. "So he's not with you? Then don't go running around like you did this afternoon. Otherwise, if something happens, how can I explain it to His Majesty and your father?" Fan Xian mysteriously moved closer to his grandmother's ear and said, "Don't worry, grandmother. Your grandson is now an ace of aces." The old woman laughed involuntarily. She covered her mouth and said nothing, revealing some of the charm she had many years ago. As they spoke, someone came in from outside to report that the banquet had begun. The grandmother and grandson met each other's eyes with great understanding. Fan Xian held the old woman's arm and walked out. The person who had come to speak was the wife of the Tang family. She lowered her head and led the way in front. Fan Xian looked at her back and suddenly said, "Has Warner's medicine been down?" The wife of the Tang family tilted her body slightly and quietly replied, "The mistress has been taking her medicine on time and in proper amounts." "Where is Dabao? How come I don't see him today?" Fan Xian was puzzled. He had not seen Dabao come to welcome him. "My husband is also here. He didn't know you would arrive early, so he is fishing on the ocean with Master Lin," the wife of the Tang family said with a smile. Fan Xian was delighted and said, "Tangda is also here. Have him come see me in a moment." "Yes." The old woman that Fan Xian was supporting suddenly opened her mouth and said, "Warner has been taking medicine recently. I was curious as to what kind of pill it is. It smells pretty good." Fan Xian was startled. He wondered if he should explain this matter to his grandmother. After thinking for a while, he finally smiled warmly. Lowering his voice to a very low level, he told her about Warner's body and the matter of the child. The old woman fell silent. Her expression did not seem very good. After a long time, she gently coughed and said, "Sir is the most important. He is still young, so there is no rush." Fan Xian smiled calmly and said, "That is why I like you the most." After the banquet, Fan Xian spoke for a while with Tangda and asked about the current situation in Jingdo, as well as his father and Lady Lu's health. At the same time, he inquired about some Jingdo market news that the Overwatch Council could not easily access. Fan Xian felt a glimmer of tiredness. After dissuading everyone and greeting his grandmother, he took Warner back to the bedroom. This bedroom still retained the same appearance as it was a few years ago. None of the furnishings had changed. Fan Xian lay on the bed and watched with slanted eyes as Warner sat by the table and played with the lantern. He listened to Cece prepare hot water outside the compartment. He suddenly opened his mouth and said, "Xiaobao, come here." Warner turned her head and giggled, but a glimmer of shyness flashed across her face. Glancing outside, she angrily said, "Don't you know to be quieter?" The so-called joy of the boudoir was not all in the matters between a man and a woman. Often it was in the small details. The so-called Xiaobao was the secret signal between Fan Xian and Warner. Small details, small tricks. Warner was the Bao's sister, so naturally it was Xiaobao. After washing up, Cece smiled and left the door. Just like in the past in Danzhou, she slept on the small bed in the compartment. After the red candles went out, Fan Xian and his wife lay side by side on the bed. Warner was like a little cat curled up in Fan Xian's arms. Her two hands tightly gripped the front of the man's unlined shirt. She gripped it a bit tightly, as if she was afraid someone would run away. "I've been lying on this bed for 16 years. Fan Xian opened his bright eyes in the darkness. "Ever since I was a child, I've always liked to sleep. When I take afternoon naps, I never need the serving girls to coax me. I just sleep like this." Warner made a sound of acknowledgement and looked at him. Chapter 435. Fan Xian felt the pain. With a pained expression, he stuck out the tip of his tongue and licked his broken lips. Suddenly, he found that there was an additional trace of sweetness. Only now did he know that the anger Warner had been holding back these few days had all exploded in this bite. He chose his words carefully and said, "It's not that I want to say anything else. I just feel that these days have been hard on you." Lin Warner turned her body in his embrace and said indistinctly, "Hard on me. I don't have time to keep you company," Fan Xian said after thinking for a bit. Fan Xian thought for a bit and said, "Now that my sister and brother have both gone to Northern Qi and Yu Linger is married, it is impossible for Rojia to play with you. Leaving Jingdo, going down to Jiangnan, and coming to Danzhou, presumably you don't even have someone by your side to talk to." Before he could finish speaking, Lin Wan-er's large eyes gradually became misty. She sighed softly and said, If you don't have a heart, you know all this. If you do have a heart, how can you bear to treat me like this?" Fan Xian's heart grew cold hearing this. He coughed and asked, "How have I treated you? Is that all you want to say?" Lin Warner looked seriously into his eyes. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then nodded. Lin Warner smiled coldly and said, "You're starting to be shameless again. In the past, I told you in Jingdo that I wouldn't stop you if you wanted to do anything. In any case, the words of a woman do not have much power. I just hope you can be more honest and tell me before anything happens. Even if I am useless now, I am still the eldest daughter-in-law of the Fan family. Some things cannot be hidden from me." "What are you talking about?" Fan Xian was faintly angry. "How can you be so self-pitying? The Warner I like is a gentle and mischievous girl." He stopped halfway through his words. On the contrary, it was Warner who smiled sweetly and said gently, "Why aren't you continuing to lecture me?" Fan Xian coughed and said, "Regardless of whether you believe me or not, I wasn't planning on saying anything else today." "Oh, is that so?" Lin Warner sighed and said, "Then, what are you going to tell me about Haidang?" Fan Xian was silent for a moment and then said, "It's not the same. It is not the same." After saying this, he hugged Warner tightly, who had flipped over in a fit of pique. One hand gently tickled her soft waist. He blew into her ear and said, We've been apart for more than 10 days. What's the point of talking about that? If it had been Haidang or Ruo, who had been influenced by Fan Xian's modern feminism, they would have kicked him off the bed. Although Wanner had grown up in the royal palace and had a head full of meticulousness and depth, when it came to matters between men and women, she had received the most traditional education. She said in a muffled voice, "That girl's identity is different. Is already troublesome, but you still act on your own. In the future, who knows what trouble you will stir up?" Fan Xian listened to these words that seemed to admit it, but his heart did not relax. On the contrary, a faint apologetic feeling welled up. People, especially men, would be lying if they said that they did not love someone. But it would be a lie if they said that they would love someone for the rest of their life. Admiring jade on the eastern mountain, watching the sunset on the western mountain, doing different things in different places. No one could deceive themselves or brainwash the world. But you stay at home every day, and there's no one to play mahjong with you. It is quite boring. Fan Xian did not want to continue on this topic because he suddenly realized that Haitan's position was still that of friend. That girl might not be willing to marry into the Fan family. Why should he worry about this ahead of time? Why should he make his wife worry and sour with him? The concubines in the palace don't just pass their days like this. Fan Xian's words touched the true weakness in the depths of Lin Wanner's heart. She couldn't help but sigh. She had grown up in the palace. Her mother was the illustrious eldest princess, and her father was Prime Minister Lin. Unfortunately, she had been locked up in the palace and had only seen her parents a few times. It was as if she had been collectively raised by the concubines in the palace. She was smart by nature and had grown up in such an environment. Even if she wasn't exceptionally smart, she at least had a clear understanding of the intrigues and trifles in the field of power. She believed that her ability should have played a greater role. It was only because of her relationship with the eldest princess that Lin Wanner was somewhat averse to scheming and was content with peace. It was also because of the hostile relationship between her husband and mother that Wanner could not have found a suitable place to shine. This was something that she and Fan Xian had discussed a long time ago. If a person could not find a place in their surroundings, they would eventually feel a sense of loss. If she was just an ordinary woman, then she could manage the household, be filial to her parents-in-law, serve her husband, and raise a daughter. But Lin Wanner's birth determined that if she continued to be ordinary, she would always feel some regret in her heart, especially since there were already many people who were beginning to shine at Fan Xian's side. At some point, Lin Wanner was already prepared to accept her fate. She was prepared to hold on to the beautiful memories of having a son over the wall and work hard to give birth to a child for Fan Xian. She wanted to tie her husband's heart to her side. That was why she had taken such a risk and stopped the medicine Fei Jia had prescribed. Fan Xian was a delicate and sensitive person. Of course, he knew the deeper meaning behind his wife's actions. He also knew what the faint worry between his wife's brows these past few months was. However, he still hadn't found a good solution. Fan Xijia's life dream was in business, so Fan Xian could kick him to the north to smuggle. Ruo's life dream had been influenced by Fan Xian, so Fan Xian could use any method to send her under Ku He's tutelage to travel thousands of li and see different people. But Wanner, her identity was different. She was his wife. Her life dream, or, to put it more crudely, what path should she seek to realize her value? The spring examination case, as well as some matters before and after, all made Fan Xian understand that Wanner's strength was actually in the palace. In terms of planning, she could indeed help him a great deal. But the problem was, at present, he and Xinjiang were like fire and water. How could he let Wanner be caught in the middle? Fan Xian sighed and said, "If there really comes a day when weapons are used against each other, I really don't know what to do." Such undisguised words were something the husband and wife rarely touched on. They had always avoided this matter. Lin Wanner was silent for a long time, and then said, I don't have much affection for my mother, but, after all, she is my mother. I understand." Fan Xian pressed his nose against her hair and took a deep breath. "Believe me, at least I won't make you sad." Would anyone believe these words? Fan Xian suddenly opened his mouth and smiled slightly. Warner, it is indeed boring to stay at home all the time. I have some things I want you to help me do, but it might be difficult and exhausting. Lynn Warner opened her eyes wide with curiosity. Turning around, she was face to face with him. What is it? With a soft fragrance in his arms, Fan Xian hugged his wife and couldn't resist rubbing the fullness a few times. Smiling, he said, "You also know that I am a rich person." Of course. Lynn Warner couldn't resist smiling. She turned her hand back and slapped the thief's hand. Fan Xian said seriously, "When I went to Jiangnan for the first time last year, I found that although Jiangnan is rich and populous, there are still many commoners who do not have clothes to cover their bodies and food to fill their stomachs. You see, even Jiangnan is like this, much less Jiangbei. There are also the commoners in the middle reaches of the Yangtze who have suffered from floods. They don't know how to survive." Lynn Warner asked curiously, "Didn't you say that the silver you found in the palace treasury has already been transferred to the river transport governor's yamen?" "That is only a portion," Fan Xian said after thinking for a bit. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then said, "You know the affairs of the court better than I do. Not many of those officials can be trusted. If I send the silver to the court, even with the Overwatch Council and Yang Wanli keeping an eye on it, what should flow away will still flow away. Not to mention anything else. At least the Fan family, the Liu family, and even the palace will eat from this silver. So I think there are some things we can do ourselves." "What things?" "Jiangnan is truly rich. Those rich merchants can take out millions of liang of silver." Fan Xian smiled coldly. Fan Xian smiled coldly and said, "But there are still so many poor people. This is a problem of inequality." He continued to sigh and said, "I don't have any ability to change this phenomenon. I can only find some mediocre methods to improve it." "You mean?" Lynn Warner guessed her husband's thoughts and said hesitantly, "You are prepared to rob the rich to give to the poor?" Fan Xian laughed loudly. He had not thought that his highborn wife would use the common bandit language from storybooks. He couldn't resist scratching her pretty nose. Warner stuck out her little tongue and giggled. "But does this really count as robbing the rich to give to the poor?" Fan Xian thought for a bit and then said seriously, "My thoughts are like this. In any case, we've taken so much silver from the palace treasury and officials, so we have to find a way to use it. Our family can't use it all. As I said earlier, we don't want to go through the path of the court. So, how can we use this silver on the commoners?" Lynn Warner made a sound of acknowledgement and said, "In the past, it was common to open a porridge shop and cultivate good deeds. I remember when I was little, there was a disaster in the north. The commoners fleeing from the famine all surged into Jingdao. A few officials in court asked the emperor to send out troops to suppress it and drive these refugees to the nearby provinces. However, Uncle Emperor did not agree to this suggestion. On the contrary, he removed those officials. At the same time, he opened the royal granaries. That year, when we were giving out porridge, the Empress Dowager even brought a few of us from the palace to hold the spoons." Fan Xian nodded. He had heard this story. The emperor was not stupid and knew how to handle it. He said, "Just giving out porridge at the last minute is not enough. Cultivating good deeds is also difficult to spread. So I decided to put the silver I earned into a specialized organization and then do good deeds for many years." He lay in a thin blanket and waved his hand. "When the poor students have no money, they go to the schools we run to study. When there's no rice to eat, we buy rice and distribute it. When there's no seedlings in spring, we give them. In short, we will do whatever the court has not thought of doing." Lynn Warner looked at his confident expression and also became excited. She immediately forced a smile and said, "Idiot, do you know how much silver this will cost? Isn't the silver earned to be spent?" Fan Xian smiled and said, "In any case, what I earn is the silver of the court and the merchants, and the court and the merchants take the silver from the hands of the common people. What is taken from the people, used for the people. This is the logic." Lynn Warner listened to the words, taking from the people and using it for the people, and couldn't help her eyes lighting up. These words are new, but they make sense. Fan Xian lowered his head and looked at his wife's worshipful expression. For some reason, He thought of last year in the Northern Qi Royal Palace in Shangjing when the Northern Qi Emperor and Haidang Duoduo heard him shout, "First worry about the worries of the world, then rejoice in the joy of the world." He couldn't help blushing with shame. Unexpectedly, Lin Wanner immediately shook her head seriously. It still won't work. Putting aside the fact that this is a bottomless pit, no matter how much you throw in, you might not be able to fill it. You have to think thrice about the influence of this matter. For the matters of the court to be snatched by you is a taboo. Fan Xian thought for a bit and then suggested, "Can't I use my name?" Lin Wanner glared at him like she was looking at an idiot. "If I don't use my name, how can such a large scene be set up? It's not like you only want to save the people of a county or a province. If they don't know it's a good deed you're in charge of, won't those local officials rush to take a bite out of this fat piece of meat? So, you have to use your name." Fan Xian thought it made sense. However, he had to use his name and couldn't make the court angry. It was truly difficult. Lin Wanner suddenly opened her mouth and said, "What do you think about using the name of the palace to do this? Using the Empress Dowager's name. In any case, we don't need the nobles in the palace to fork out money. We'll fork out the money and let them bear this name. The court will have light, and they will also have face. Presumably, the emperor will also be happy." Fan Xian paused and looked at Lin Wanner without saying anything for a long time. He thought to himself that this was indeed the case. With the nobles in the palace stepping out, it would certainly be much easier to carry out. Then, wasn't this the so-called general benevolent organization he often saw in his previous life? However, the Qin kingdom was just starting out. Presumably, it would be much cruder. However, since there was a beginning, it would improve the lives of the common people. Lin Wanner's interest was piqued, and she continued to suggest ideas. "But, no matter how rich you are, you won't be able to afford such torment. I think it's better to help the needy and not the poor. The true focus should still be on reading and disaster relief. The daily things to do." Halfway through her words, she stopped. Fan Xian also stopped. The two of them looked at each other and then laughed at the same time. There was a glimmer of embarrassment and self-mockery in their laughter. Just what should be done to make the people of the Qin kingdom and even the world live better. This pair of husband and wife were both born with golden spoons in their mouths. How could they know the details? It was just a general discussion. If they really wanted to talk about the specifics, they would only go around in circles on reading and serving porridge. After laughing for a while, Fan Xian said seriously, "We still have to do it. There will always be people who understand these things. Yang Wanli was born poor. Once the matter of the dike has calmed down, we'll summon him to the capital to talk about it." The reforms of his previous life flashed through his mind. Although the Qing Miao and the like looked bright and fresh, Fan Xian knew he did not have the power to change the general situation. He thought to himself that he could only go so and patch things up. Although it was trivial and couldn't change much, it could at least make the lives of the common people a little better. Even if it was just a little, this matter could still be done. In any case, Fan Xian didn't need to worry about it. He only needed to spend some money. "I'll leave this matter to you." Fan Xian looked at Wanner with a smile. Wanner was startled and said, "How can you leave such an important matter to me?" "If you do it, I'm at ease," Fan Xian said with a smile. "Besides, if we want to get the nobles and ladies in the palace to buy shares, if you don't show up, how can it be done? If the women do it, the risk will be less than if I show up. Don't say you're not willing to do it." Willing. Hearing this, Lin Wanner was endlessly excited. It wasn't easy to have something to do. How could she miss this opportunity? The husband and wife said a few more words and prepared to do it after some time. During this time, Fan Xian couldn't help but say a few beautiful things like, "It is better to teach a man to fish than to teach a man to fish," which shook Wanner again and again. The couple talked non-stop and, on the contrary, lost their desire to sleep. "How long have you been preparing for this?" Lin Wanner buried her head in his chest and asked in a humming voice. Fan Xian let the cat out of the bag. "Almost half a year." Lin Wanner looked at Fan Xian's pretty face and felt a glimmer of warmth in the depths of her heart. She knew that the majority of the reason Fan Xian was doing this was for her. In reality, in Fan Xian's view, he was doing this completely for Wanner. However, The husband and wife on the bed had not expected that such an organization that had appeared in the world with a flash of inspiration, because Fan Xian controlled too many resources and relied on Wan Er's ability, had gradually deviated from their initial ideas and gradually evolved into an organization no one could have predicted. For the world and Fan Xian himself, it had brought many benefits. Don't put all this silver in one place. Lin Wanner blinked her long eyelashes and said seriously. Although I don't know anything about economics, from what you and Xija have done, I can understand that money can make money. Fan Xian nodded. Naturally, he would not make it hard for himself in doing these things. The second prince was earning money in the north, and sure Chomley and Sang when we're in the flesh business in the south. After the large sum of money house property came in, it would become a source of living water. Seeing that Wanner had recovered her bright temperament and knew that she was starting to get excited after having something to do, Fan Xian was also very happy in his heart. The matter he had thought about for so long had finally had the desired effect. What made him most happy was that, with this interruption, perhaps those family matters would fade away. Unexpectedly, things did not always go as one wished. Lin Wanner bit her lip and said, "But you still haven't answered me about the matter we talked about earlier." Fan Xian chuckled and pulled her into his embrace affectionately. Vaguely, he said, "Don't worry, there won't be anything like this again." It was still that old saying, who could believe a man's words? As expected, Lin Wanner did not believe it. She used her eyes to glance outside and quietly said, "Although Cece has entered the family without a ceremony, it will be unfair to her. I've already talked to grandmother. In a few days, we'll have to do it." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Do whatever you want. In any case, she grew up with me, so she probably doesn't care about this." The voices of husband and wife were very quiet. At this moment, the sound of Cece coughing came from the little bed in the outer room. The coughing was full of embarrassment and anger. Lin Wanner gazed at Fan Xian and giggled. "Did you hear that? Who said I don't care?" Fan Xian awkwardly slapped her bottom and said, "Usually this girl sleeps like a pig. Why did she wake up so suddenly today?" Speaking of sleeping like a pig, Lin Wanner immediately thought of Siki, who had followed her into the Fan Manor. She was also her personal serving girl. Back then, in the courtyard, she had been charmed by Fan Xian every day. Even if she had not done much, she had worked hard. She furrowed her brows and said, "What about Siki?" Looking at Wanner's expression, Fan Xian knew that this mistress of the household very much wanted her servant girl to also enter the family. However, Fan Xian was truly afraid of these things. Begging for mercy, he said, "Forget it. It's not like I have sex 7 times in one night." Wanner glanced at him faintly and angrily. After a torment, the husband and wife were finally tired. Fan Xian hugged his wife in satisfaction and said by her ear, "Tomorrow, I'll take you somewhere." Lin Wanner said in a daze, "Danzhou is not big. I've already seen it all. Where else do we need to go?" Putting aside Fan Xian and his wife's one-day trip to Danzhou, after returning to Danzhou, they would be busy for a while. Fan Xian had enough to deal with just receiving old acquaintances. How would he find time to play? Additionally, one day, the grandmother finally presided over the matter. Cece, who had had an accident with Fan Xian on the boat, was finally taken into the room without incident. However, Cece was used to serving Fan Xian, so she could not immediately accept this change in role. She appeared confused and at a loss as to what to do. Regarding this, everyone had long been mentally prepared. Cece had grown up with Fan Xian, and their relationship was very good. Many of the servants in the manor still remember that year. When Fan Xian had stood up for Cece at the age of 12, he had beaten the housekeeper from Jingdo black and blue. After the housekeeper was humiliated, he left. However, no news of him was heard afterward. No one knew where he had gone. Furthermore, after Fan Xian went to Jingdo, Danzhou received the news of his marriage. The great ancestor sent Cece to Jingdo. Who didn't know the hidden meaning behind this? Everyone in the Jingdo and Danzhou manors knew that one day, Cece would enter the room. However, after it finally happened, Other than congratulating Cece, the serving girls in the Count's manor still couldn't help feeling envious and jealous. The old woman gave Cece a large red envelope and spoke warmly for a while. Cece cried loudly and her eyes were red. Even Warner was wiping away her tears at the side. The next morning, the back door of the Fan Manor was pulled open with a squeak. Fan Xian held Cece's hand and walked out the door sneakily. He turned his head to glance at the girl whose eyes were as red and swollen as peaches. Amused, he said, "Did I bully you or what?" Cece choked and glared at him. In any case, in this manner, she was the only one who dared to be impolite to Fan Xian. She looked at the rising fog in Danzhou and the quiet roads. Unable to resist, she asked curiously, "Young master, where are we going?" Look, she still couldn't change the way she addressed him. Fan Xian held her hand and felt that it was indeed a bit exciting. It was like a clandestine affair. However, they had clearly just openly entered the room yesterday. From this, it could be seen that men were indeed a very despicable animal. A warm smile flashed across his face. "We're going to buy tofu to eat. I recommend the new book, The Last Immortal. Book number 182558. It is very well written. Everyone can go take a look and add it to your collection. Thank you, everyone, for the honor." To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 436. Early in the morning, Danzhou was quiet. Particularly in the area of the Count's manor, there was no extra sound. Danzhou was not large. Living in the city, one could faintly hear the crowing of chickens in the villages outside the city, but the barking of dogs was nothing. If one listened carefully, they might even be able to hear who was emptying the toilet bowl, who was boiling water for breakfast, and the people in the distant market had already woken up long ago, using fresh vegetables and meat to seduce the women who had woken up early in the morning to cook. On a summer morning, the air was fresh. Fan Xian and Cece walked along the quiet streets of the city and came to the side of the familiar market. He sniffed the thickening smell in the air and shook his head in satisfaction. "I haven't come to a place like this much in the past 2 years." Cece glanced at him from the side and thought, as an imperial envoy, he would never have the chance to buy vegetables again. Fan Xian quietly said, "Do you still remember when we were in Danzhou? We often came to the market to buy things." Cece nodded and smiled. Young master has always wandered around the city with the older sisters since he was young and even helped them carry things. In the beginning, you scared many people. I heard about it when I entered the manor, and I also thought you were a strange person. Do you still think I'm strange? Fan Xian smiled in response and walked into the market first. When he passed by a 2-story building, he unconsciously stopped his steps and turned his body to stare at it. Cece felt it was strange and asked, "What is it?" Fan Xian pointed at the building and said curiously, "Isn't that old Ha's house? Didn't they say the building was burned down? Who lives there now?" Hearing this, Cece also remembered. She tilted her head and thought for a while. Apologetically, she said, "I've never heard them mention it." Fan Xian gazed at the newly built 2-story building in a daze. Old Ha, the vegetable delivery man, and the assassin from the Overwatch Council's Dongshan Road had both died here. After the matter, grandmother had people burn this building down to destroy the bodies and all evidence. The people of Danzhou had no idea the truth of this matter and thought it was just a normal fire. His expression calmed. That was 12 years after he came to this world. It was here that he had killed for the first time. The market was in a hubbub. The fisherman on the sea was pushing a cart, silently comparing the price of the first fish of the day with the fishmongers in the field. Meanwhile, the fresh silver fish in the basket on the cart kept bouncing, making popping sounds. From time to time, carts would be pushed in, and the hawkers would yell loudly to make way for them. The vegetable leaves in the second row were stained with dew, delicious and tempting. On the chicken stall in the compartment, the chickens were cackling along with the stench. In the west corner, a big white pig was letting out its last cry under the butcher's knife. There were already many Danjo commoners who had come to buy vegetables and food. They had to hurry early to buy the freshest vegetables. The customs of the people of Danjo were simple. Additionally, the Qing emperor had been especially kind to the people, giving them generosity year after year. Thus, the people lived well. At least, they could afford to eat meat every day. Seeing this, Fan Xian couldn't help but feel moved. The kingdom of Qing was not bad. After walking a few steps, he came to the quietest corner of the market. Looking at the figure in the distance at the tofu stall, Fan Xian stopped walking. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the familiar curve of a waist, the young woman's rosy face, and her slightly well-rounded body. He smiled warmly and thought to himself, I've been carried by her since I was a child, but I still can't get tired of looking at her. Cece looked at the woman and smiled happily. She prepared to run in that direction. Unexpectedly, Fan Xian grabbed her hand. She glanced back with confusion. Fan Xian smiled and said, Why must we meet? It's fine to look from afar. Looking at Donger's expression, her days should be good. Let's not disturb her. Cece didn't understand. Since she had sneaked out, was she really not going to meet him? Was she just going to stupidly look from afar? The manor gives her a monthly stipend. This is what I want. Fan Xian seemed to be comforting himself. With this money, she should have no problems living. The young woman selling tofu was called Dong. Back in the day, she had been a serving girl in the Count's manor in Danzhou. This woman had begun to carry Fan Xian when she was 10 and had carried him until he was 10. Their relationship was not ordinary. However, by the time Fan Xian was 10, the girl was getting older. Additionally, Fan Xian knew that his future life would be very dangerous. Thus, he found an excuse to chase her out of the manor. He only continued to help her in secret. He liked Donger, so he wanted to arrange a normal and happy life for Donger. However, it seemed that a normal and happy life did not come so easily. Fan Xian and Cece watched for a while. Suddenly, they saw 4 or 5 large men surrounding Donger's tofu stall. They were excitedly talking about something. Fan Xian's eyes narrowed, and a glimmer of coldness flashed across his delicate face. Although the men were agitated, they did not seem to be overbearing, nor did they do anything too excessive, so for the time being, he did not go berserk. He indicated for Cece to follow him closer to the tofu stall. Hearing their conversation clearly, he also saw the wrinkles at the corners of Donger's eyes. Involuntarily, his heart darkened. Donger, it's not that we're forcing you. It's just that this debt has already dragged on for a year. It should be paid, right? The leading man furrowed his brows and said, Go ask around. The money we've given you is already the most generous kind. There's no longer such a low interest rate. Donger rubbed her hands helplessly. Her hands had been soaked in tofu water for a long time. They were a little red and rough. She lowered her head and said awkwardly, Just a few more days, just a few more days. You know that my husband's health hasn't been good this year. His illness has cost a lot of money. The large man glanced at her and suddenly said, I say, Donger, how can you be so unreasonable? Donger raised her head in confusion. The burly man chuckled and said, Let's not talk about anything else. This city deputy, Guan, has always collected the least money from you. Our boss also didn't ask you for a high interest rate. Everyone in the market respects you. Why is that? Isn't it because you came from the Count's manor? Although on the surface you were chased out of the manor, which of us old people in Danzhou doesn't know? The young master of the Fan family loves you the most. When you were little, he always hung out at your tofu stall to play. He cleared his throat and said, We all give young Master Fan face, and no one dares to bully you. But, he suddenly said angrily, This silver isn't much. You can just go to the Count's manor and say a few words to the old madam. Won't she help you? Donger pressed her lips together tightly and refused to say another word. The large man finally couldn't resist and said, Even if you don't dare to go and tell the old madam, everyone now knows about the major matter in the Danzhou government. The young master of the Fan family has already returned to his hometown. He is now an imperial envoy. If he casually takes care of you, your entire family will soar. Why would he care about this silver? Donger suddenly raised her head and said with a resolute expression, don't disturb the mansion about my matters. I will naturally repay you the money I owe you slowly. Big brother, who, thank you for taking care of me these past 2 years. Dong is very grateful. However, these words clearly had no effect. Although the large man didn't dare to threaten Donger, he still needed to rely on this to earn money. He angrily said, "Since you say you don't have any friendship with the manor, then we won't be polite. Give me the silver you deserve today." Hearing this, Fan Xian finally understood the reason of the matter and couldn't help but smile bitterly. Donger's mother was probably not in good health, but the money he had the manor send over every month should be enough. Looking at Donger's expression, she probably hadn't been willing to use the silver he had sent over these 2 years and was only willing to rely on this tofu stall to barely make ends meet. There was no need to continue listening. Fan Xian also didn't have the hobby of waiting for the situation to intensify before coming out to be a boss, even though it was clear that he was currently the most powerful boss in Danzhou. He nodded his head at Cece. Cece immediately understood. She took a few quick steps and arrived in front of the tofu stall. Looking at the large men, she calmly asked, "How much do you need?" The large men were clearly startled by the sudden appearance of this girl. Although Cece didn't deliberately dress up when she went out today, she lived in a wealthy family every day. The clothes and decorations on her body were all luxurious. The large men had sharp eyes and knew that this girl's background was not ordinary. They coughed lightly and respectfully said, "It's only 10 liang of silver." As they spoke, the eyes of these burly men floated around the tofu shop. When Donger saw Cece standing in front of her tofu stall, she was already stunned. A moment later, a helpless smile appeared on her flushed face. The leader of the group suddenly glanced at the young master standing behind the tofu shop. Looking at the young master's delicate and pretty face, and then thinking about the background of the tofu shop owner, Donger, and the beautiful lady in front of him, he immediately guessed the young master's identity. He hurriedly added in a trembling voice, "It is indeed 10 taels of silver. This interest, I didn't dare to charge it too much. Since Lady Dong is here today, it will naturally be completely waived." Cece's face was full of smiles. She turned her head to glance at Donger and said, "Sister, is it this much?" Donger was still immersed in shock and nodded her head in a panic. Cece glanced at Fan Xian. Of course, this girl knew what Fan Xian was thinking. She smiled at the large men and said, "I can also see that you all have intentions of protecting my sister. I thank you for this intention on behalf of my young master." As she spoke, she took out a small silver note from her sleeve and handed it over. Warmly, she said, "In the future, help me look after this shop." The large man took the silver note and looked. It was a 20 denomination. He couldn't help but want to return it with a pained expression. However, he then glanced at the young man's face behind the tofu stall, his emotions unknown. He didn't dare to say anything more. In a trembling voice, he said, I wouldn't dare. Of course, of course." After saying this, he quickly pulled the confused subordinates behind him and hurriedly left. When he passed by Fan Xian, he bowed deeply to the ground and didn't even dare to let out a fart. Fan Xian shook his head and walked into the tofu stall. Facing Donger, who still didn't believe her eyes, he complained, "You have money and don't use it. Why did you borrow expensive interest?" Donger forced a smile and glanced at him. In a quiet voice, she said, "Young master, why have you come?" Fan Xian angrily said, "It was the same a few years ago, and it's still the same now. You are my servant girl. Can't I come to see you?" To the side, Cece covered her mouth and laughed. I wonder who was just standing there and not coming over. Having said this, she walked to Donger's side and affectionately held her hand. Dong was a little flustered as she rubbed her hands on the cloth in front of her. She smiled warmly. Fan Xian fixed his gaze on Donger's face and looked more closely at the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes. Time was merciless. It had not left too deep a mark on the young woman's face. However, the daily chores and small business always made her appear tired, particularly when he was standing next to Cece, and compared to Cece, a servant girl who lived like a prince, he appeared even more uncomfortable. Fan Xian sighed. Suddenly, he didn't know what to say. With a serious expression, he asked, "Where is the little girl?" "She's at home with her father. Her father is not well." Donger glanced at Fan Xian's expression and smiled warmly and warmly. She had raised Fan Xian and knew what he was thinking. She could also guess why he was unhappy. In a quiet voice, she said, "I don't dare to use the money young master sent carelessly. In any case, it can be used to—" Without waiting for her to finish, Fan Xian waved his hand angrily and said, "Take me to your house to sit and talk." Donger glanced at her tofu stall and was so embarrassed she didn't know what to say. Fan Xian angrily said, "Why do you care about such a broken stall? Back then, I messed it up. What ordinary life? If you had always been with me, you wouldn't have to suffer such filthy air." Seeing his anger, Donger didn't say anything more. Cece went forward to hold her hand and walked out of the market. Fan Xian walked out of the tofu stall behind the two of them. He glared coldly at the gazes that were focused on him from all around the market. After thinking for a bit, he picked up the 2 pieces of tofu that he had finished making in his hands. Only then did he leisurely stroll out. After he left, the entire market exploded into noise like a frying pan. At this time, all of the peddlers recognized who he was and couldn't help but sink into shock and excitement. The imperial envoy had come to the market. What wonderful gossip it was, particularly when there was the servant girl of the past, the tofu beauty of the present, and other such guesswork. "Did you see that? I told you, young Master Fan is someone who cherishes old friendships. Since he has returned to Danzhou, naturally, he will come to see Sister Donger." Someone clicked their tongue and sighed. Imperial Envoy. How high of an official must he be to still be so nostalgic? Someone gossiped, and someone scolded back. "Don't you see that Sister Cece is also here? If you dare to spout nonsense again, be careful that someone from the manor will send you to the west to fight the Hu people." Regardless of how the discussion in the market fermented, the might of the Fan Manor was here. Fan Xian's reputation was here. Some rumors without a head or tail naturally died without any cause. However, Fan Xian's sudden arrival and the sudden closure of the tofu shop injected a glimmer of the liveliness of the already lively market in the morning. No one thought that there would be no tofu to eat in Danzhou today. Donger's home was in a small courtyard in a remote part of Danzhou. It was quietly hidden in the depths of a small alley. Although such an independent courtyard was common in Danzhou, it was still worth a lot of money. It had been bought by Fan Xian on the day of Donger's marriage using the money from selling the internal court newspaper pan, Ling's calligraphy. At the time, Fan Xian had put in a lot of effort. Donger did not dare disobey the wishes of the 11-year-old young master and had lived there until today. However, the decorations in the courtyard were somewhat old. Fan Xian walked into the courtyard and looked around. He found that it was relatively clean and tidy. Nodding his head with satisfaction, he placed the 2 squares of tofu in his hands on the stone grinder. Putting his hands behind his back, he entered the main hall. Donger was busy pouring tea and taking out snacks. Fan Xian stopped her and smiled. "It's not like you don't know my temper. I don't like to eat those things." Donger smiled warmly and said, "At that time, everyone in the manor said that the young master was a strange child. A child who didn't like to eat snacks, but liked to gnaw on bones." "Yes, a strange child." Fan Xian sighed and said, "Only you don't think I'm strange." Cece randomly wiped at the low couch. She knew that Fan Xian didn't care about such things, so she invited him to sit. Fan Xian shook his head and lifted the curtain on the left side of the main hall. Without any awkwardness, he charged in. Entering the room, he saw a man about 30 years old struggling to get up from the bed. The man's features were regular and had a sense of loyalty. However, his face was a bit pale. It looked like his health was not very good. Seeing Fan Xian go into the room, Donger jumped up in panic and quickly followed him in. "Young master, this is where the sick stay. What are you doing in here?" The man on the bed was Donger's husband. His surname was Mai. He had long guessed the identity of the visitor. Ever since he knew that the young master of the Fan family was returning to Danzhou, he had been discussing with Donger whether or not the young master of the Fan family would come to visit. After all, The difference in their statuses was too great. Thinking that this matter was very unlikely, the two of them relaxed and did not make any preparations. "Young Master Fan, don't come in," he said in a panic. He was quite frightened. Fan Xian smiled and directly sat down by his side. One hand felt his pulse and used his gaze to indicate for him to calm down. Dong stood at the door and guessed that the young master was treating her husband. She couldn't help but feel a glimmer of doubt. Back in the manor, she had seen the young master holding up a medical book and reading it. However, even the doctors in the city said it was difficult to treat this illness. Her husband was even more nervous. Seeing Fan Xian's finger feel his pulse, he thought to himself that this was the present imperial envoy. According to the rumors, he was a dragon. How could he treat him? He was endlessly excited and moved. His eyes began to moisten. The room was silent. Cece did not enter the room. She just watched carefully from behind Dong. After a long time, Fan Xian released his finger and opened his eyes. Smiling slightly, he said, "What a coincidence. It is a problem of the lungs. It is easy to treat." Hearing these words, Dong and her husband were overjoyed, but they still did not believe it. Cece covered her mouth and smiled. "Don't worry. The young mistress also has a problem of the lungs. Even the imperial doctors in the palace could not cure it. It was all cured by the young master." Writing this chapter, I thought of Shirin, Baoyu, and Song Zer. Haha, Donger and Fan Xian are much stronger than those two sesame seed cakes. I've been so happy writing recently. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author and support the original reading. Chapter 437. After hearing Cece's words, Dong and her husband couldn't help but be overjoyed. When they thought about how this illness had caused their family to suffer over the past year, Dong couldn't help but lift her sleeve and carefully wipe the corners of her eyes. Fan Xian had Dong prepare a brush and ink. After thinking for a moment, he wrote down a prescription and looked it over twice. After confirming there were no problems, he blew it dry and gave it to her. He told her to prepare the medicine on time and not be stingy with the silver. Dong smiled slightly and agreed. Fan Xian looked at her expression and knew that this sister might not listen to his words. He couldn't resist getting angry again and said, "What reason is there for me to make myself suffer?" Dong only smiled gratefully and didn't reply to him. Fan Xian was angry. The weather was hot, and Fan Xian only wore an unlined garment. He was also in Danzhou, so he wasn't worried, so he didn't bring the medicine box with him. He said to Cece, "When we go back tonight, remember to remind me to pick up a few pills." He then turned his head to Donger's husband and said warmly, "My Sheener, you have to take this medicine often. However, I don't think Danzhou will have enough medicine. When I return to Jingdo in a few days, your family will come with me. After all, you're the head of the family. I have to ask for your opinion first and see if there is anything in Danzhou that you can't let go of." My Sheener opened his mouth wide and was speechless for a long time. He knew what the young master meant. His family would follow the young master to the capital. How could they have a hard time? But he coughed twice and looked at Dong with an inquiring gaze. Cece watched coldly from the side and couldn't resist smiling slightly. Her young master's personality was like this. When he met a woman close to him, he couldn't be forceful. He also couldn't force Dong to do anything, so he could only act on Brother Mai. How could Dong not know what Fan Xian meant? She sighed and said, "The young master has written a prescription, so it must be good. I promise you, I will never borrow money again. These years, you have sent home over 100 liang of silver, and I promise you that I will use it all. In Danzhou, 100 liang of silver is enough to live a good life. Don't worry." Cece looked at Fan Xian's expression and encouraged him from the side. That pill can't be made even with money. Even if the young master found a medicine shop in Jingdo and made it, would he have time to travel thousands of li to deliver it to you? Dong looked at her awkwardly and said, "What kind of pill would require so much effort?" To the side, Fan Xian shook his head and said with a smile, Do you still remember that ugly teacher in a manor? When Dong-er heard this, she immediately thought of his messy hair and eyes that shone with green light like those of a hungry wolf. She subconsciously shivered and covered her mouth in disgust. What is Mr. Timothy doing? Back then, we were afraid of him. This medicine was concocted by Mr. Fei. Fan Xian laughed loudly and said, although he was born in an ugly family, you should know that he is the famous Sir Fei Jie of the Qin Kingdom. Dong-er sank into shock. It was not until today that she knew that the teacher who had looked like a pervert had such an important identity. Thinking of the young master's past, she could accept it more easily. Fan Xian turned and smiled slightly at Dong-er's husband. Prepare to go with me to the capital. Dong-er's husband was loyal and honest, but he did not have his own opinions. Hearing Fan Xian's resolute and decisive words, he unconsciously made a sound of assent. However, Dong-er huffed coldly and glared at him. My Sheener quickly shut his mouth. Looking at this scene, Fan Xian couldn't resist smiling. It looked like in this family, Dong-er was the one with the most power. Rest well and recover. What are you worrying about? Dong-er yelled angrily at her man. Rising, she pulled Fan Xian and Cece out of the bedroom and sat down in the middle of the hall. They drank some tea and chatted a bit. However, no matter how strict Fan Xian was, Dong-er remained stubborn and silent when it came to the suggestion of going to Jingdo. She refused to open her mouth and agree. Fan Xian looked at the woman's expression and couldn't help but sigh. He thought to himself that such a gentle sister also had such a stubborn side. A few coughs came from the bedroom. Fan Xian tilted his ear to listen and lowered his voice. Gently, he said, Sister Dong-er, before you got married, I took you to secretly see Brother Mai. You liked him, so I didn't pay attention to this matter. Back then, I also asked clearly. Brother Mai's parents died when he was young. He is a loyal and honest person. In Danzhou, he also doesn't have any troublesome relatives. Presumably, he will treat you well after marriage. Only then did I relax. This was the truth. When Sister Dong-er got married, Fan Xian was not more than 11 years old. However, he had secretly observed for a long time before he was at ease to promise his serving girl to the Mai family. Dong-er rubbed her reddened hands nervously and said shyly, He treats me well now. How bad can the person you like be? Since you don't have any relatives in Danzhou, why aren't you willing to go with me to Jingdo? I made a mistake back then, Fan Xian recalled. Fan Xian thought back and said, If I left you outside, these days might not be any more peaceful. Without waiting for Dong-er to speak, he continued, Don't worry, I will take care of you in Jingdo. You can continue to open your tofu shop. However, with you by my side, we can look after each other. Fan Xian did not need Dong-er to look after him. The meaning of these words was clear. Cece also urged from the side, Yes, Sister Dong. Did you know that after the young master went to Jingdo, the first business he opened was a tofu shop? Nowadays, all the manors in Jingdo are eating our tofu. Fan Xian's brows moved, and he smiled bitterly. He thought, why do the words she said sound so awkward? Cece smiled and continued. If you go, won't this tofu sell even better? Dong-er hesitated for a moment and then said, Actually, I understand what the young master means and am grateful. However, I really don't want to go to Jingdo. Why? Fan Xian furrowed his brows and asked. Dong-er thought for a bit. A warm smile suddenly flashed across her face. She slowly said, After living in Danzhou for a long time, who wants to leave their home? Besides, although Jingdo is good, the place is too big. I'm afraid I'll panic if I go. Besides, I don't want to trouble the young master to always look after me. There are no demons in Jingdo. What's there to panic about? Cece muttered to the side. Dong-er covered her mouth and smiled. Who's like you, little girl? You've been so daring since you were little. As they spoke, a childish voice suddenly rang out from outside the courtyard. Dong-er's expression suddenly became increasingly gentle. She stood, walked to the door, and looked out. At this time, the sun had already risen to the middle of the sky. The blazing sunlight brushed past the edge of the eaves and shone on the woman's still beautiful face. The light suddenly became gentle, and the woman's expression seemed so peaceful and content. The little girl who had been playing outside had returned. Dong led her daughter into the room. Pointing at Fan Xian sitting in the middle, she said, "Call him young master." Fan Xian looked at the little girl held by Dong Er's hand. A genuine smile rose to his face. In the blink of an eye, 2 years had passed. The girl's eyes had already opened up. She had inherited her mother's elegance and was beginning to be eye-catching. The childishness between her brows made one feel pity for her. Particularly, her spirited and lively eyes were staring curiously at him. "Call him uncle." Fan Xian reached out and pulled the little girl into his arms. Looking at her nervous and uneasy, he smiled and said, "We haven't seen each other for a few years. How come you don't recognize me?" The little girl raised her face and looked at Fan Xian's beautiful face. She tilted her head and thought for a moment. Suddenly, she giggled and said, "Uncle, where did you go to play?" Just as Fan Xian had been raised by Dong, Fan Xian often hung out at the tofu shop when he was young. He had also carried this child countless times. Furthermore, he doted on and loved her. He often bought little things for her. Thus, the little girl had a deep impression of this uncle. Although she was still young, she remembered it clearly. "She's 9, right?" Fan Xian asked Dong, as he studied the little girl's face in his arms. Dong smiled warmly and said, "You have a good memory, young master. She'll be 10 in a few months." Fan Xian looked at the large cloth bag on the little girl's body. Lifting her above his head, he weighed her. Satisfied, he said, "Your body is not weak. However, a little girl shouldn't go out and play all day. She's so young. Donger, don't let her do things. It's hard on our girl." Donger smiled and said, "How could I bear to let her do things? She just came back from school." Fan Xian turned to look at her curiously and put the little girl down. The little girl obediently bowed to Cece. Only then did Cece pinch the little girl's cheeks with heartache. She took out the gift that Fan Xian had prepared and placed it in the little girl's hands. The little girl looked at her mother. Having received permission, she happily accepted the gift. As she rubbed her slightly aching face, she said to her mother, "Mother, I'm going to brew some medicine for father." Dong looked at her pitifully and nodded. The little girl skipped happily into the inner room with the gift in her hands. Looking at this scene, in addition to the previous sentence, Fan Xian suddenly saw Dong in a new light. To be able to raise such a sensible child, Dong was truly not simple. Although many noble young ladies in the Qing kingdom would go to the family school to study when they were young, and there were even private schools for girls in the capital, among the common people, the status of girls was still very low. As for going to school, that was something that had never been heard of. For Dong to be able to let her own daughter go to school, her boldness was not something an ordinary girl could compare to. Fan Xian looked at her and said in praise, "You've done well. This child must continue to study." Dong smiled warmly. After thinking for a while, she said, "It's just that she is a girl. Although she knows that learning to read and understand is always good, I don't know what to do in the future." "What to do?" Fan Xian laughed. "With me, her uncle, here, she can do whatever she wants under the sky." This was a promise. Dong was overjoyed, but she knew that the young master did not like her bowing, so she only looked at him gratefully. Fan Xian then said seriously, "Don't make random marriage arrangements. Even if you want to marry, you have to let me know first." Dong smiled contentedly and nodded. As they chatted, it was time for lunch. Dong said awkwardly, "Young master, please sit for a while. I'll go prepare." Fan Xian knew that if he ate at her house, there would certainly be a lot of noise. He might even have to borrow some ingredients from the neighbors, so he quickly stopped her. "Of course we have to eat at your house, but don't make it so troublesome. We'll just eat the tofu rice you used to make in the past." Dong suddenly made a sound and held her forehead angrily. "I haven't even ordered the starch yet. If it's left in the shop, I'm afraid it won't be edible." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Did you forget that I brought 2 plates?" After busying themselves, Dong husband was also helped out of the bedroom by the little girl. Although he had not used the medicine that Fan Xian had made, During the diagnosis earlier, Fan Xian had already sent a streak of Tianyi Dao's natural Jinqi into him, so my Miao Er's spirit was clearly much better. Everyone in the house gathered around the Kong and ate a lively meal of tofu rice. Dong Er's family of 3 couldn't help but feel apologetic and uncomfortable, but Fan Xian ate happily. Earlier, when he saw Dong Er's motherly appearance as she sat by the door, he knew that Dong Er's life could still continue to be happy and that she didn't necessarily have to follow him to Jingdo. "Uncle, is Jingdo fun?" the little girl asked curiously with wide eyes. She held a large rice bowl and used her long chopsticks to dig at the soft tofu rice. "Jingdo is not fun." Fan Xian put down the bowl and looked at the little girl seriously. "It's very not fun. But if I don't go play, how would we know? Do you want to go see Uncle in the future?" "Yes," the little girl said excitedly. Returning to the Count's manor, he told Wan'er about what happened that day. Wan'er listened to Fan Xian's narration and couldn't stop her eyes from turning red. When she heard that Dong insisted on not going to Jingdo, she felt even more respect for her. Once outside, Fan Xian stretched lazily, rubbed his somewhat full belly, and gently clapped his palms. A shadow slowly emerged from the sunlight beside the pillar. The tiger guards now knew Fan Xian's temper and his strength, so they didn't follow him closely like they had in the past. Only this shadow, after chasing back the 9th-level swordsman from Dongyi, became a maggot attached to Fan Xian's bones. Fan Xian tilted his head to look at him and said, "Following me like this every day, isn't it annoying?" The shadow thought about it seriously for a while and said, "It is indeed very annoying." Fan Xian smiled and said, "Isn't it annoying to follow a cripple?" The shadow replied straightforwardly, "There are beautiful women by the cripple's side." Fan Xian was speechless and shook his head helplessly. "You saw it today. What do you think about my Xin Er's illness? Since there were no signs before, his body is good. He shouldn't have gotten such a serious illness," the shadow said in a low voice. "He should have suffered an external injury and then contracted the disease." Fan Xian nodded silently. This judgment was very close to the situation he had personally found in the clinic. A moment later, he calmly said, "It is not convenient for me to ask them about this in person. Given Dong Er's outwardly smooth but inwardly square temperament, I'm afraid he won't say it. There is no one in Danzhou who dares not to give me face, so this matter is probably a misunderstanding. Go investigate and teach them a lesson. Don't let them die." Fan Xian set a boundary and calmly said, "If they were kicked, you should also kick them. Kick them until they can't get out of bed for 3 years." The shadow tilted his head to look at him. A moment later, he said, "You want me to kick people?" His tone was a bit strange. Indeed, this was the leader of the Overwatch Council's assassin gang, the most powerful assassin in the world. Would Fan Xian order him to kick people because of a small matter in a remote province? "You are the best in the world when it comes to killing people." Fan Xian smiled warmly and patted his shoulder. "Presumably your ability to kick people is also not bad. Thank you for your hard work." The shadow had nothing to say and sank back into the darkness. Coming to his grandmother's bedroom, he followed the customs of previous years and properly bowed to greet her. He then told her what had happened when he went to see Dong Er. Fan Xian knew that in a place like Danzhou, there was nothing that could be hidden from his grandmother, so he felt vaguely uncomfortable in his heart. His grandmother should know what he was thinking. How could she bear to let her serving girl suffer such filthy treatment in the city? Even her husband had been bullied to the point of lying in bed. Looking at Fan Xian's expression, the old woman knew what he was thinking. She smiled and said, "You resent me in your heart. I wouldn't dare." Although Fan Xian said this, his tone was a bit stiff. The old woman looked at her grandson's rare expression of anger and couldn't resist laughing. She explained the whole story. For some reason, the son of the previous governor had taken a liking to Dong Er. However, that son was not an idiot. Of course, he would not use force in Danzhou in front of the Count's manor. He would only go to the tofu shop and pester her shamelessly. Dong had been pestered to the point where she couldn't do anything, but he didn't use any despicable methods, so she could only endure. Although a woman could endure, a woman's man could not. My goo, finally exploded out of his little universe and gave the sun a good beating. After all, the sun's father was the current governor. Although Dong, husband's body was sturdy, he was no match for a crowd of fists. He was knocked to the ground and sent to prison. It was only because the old woman spoke that the governor did not continue to pester him. Because of this, my was kicked in the chest and suffered some damp and cold air in the prison. He fell ill and lay in bed the entire time. Listening to his grandmother's narration, Fan Xian's expression was calm. Now that he knew the cause of this matter, he also understood why Dong was silent. In the end, it was my Ge who made the first move. Furthermore, although the people of Danzhou knew of his relationship with Dong Er's family, in the eyes of the people of the world, even in his grandmother's eyes, Dong was just a servant girl who had long been kicked out of the family. She was a servant, while the other was the son of the governor. The difference in social class was always there. With such an outcome, the people of Danzhou would not feel that the Fan Manor had done anything wrong. On the contrary, they would feel that the Fan Manor had helped Dong Er's family greatly. However, Fan Xian would not think this way. In his heart, the division of people was never based on social class. It was only based on closeness. The old woman looked at his thoughtful expression and couldn't resist opening her mouth to ask, "What is it?" "Nothing." Fan Xian raised his head with a smile. "I'll have someone go and kick that son." The old woman started and immediately smiled. "Then go ahead and kick him, as you please. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu. Calm. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 438. After some small talk, Fan Xian took the opportunity to once again bring up the suggestion of asking grandmother to come with him to Jingdo to retire. Just like that night, the old woman used her silence to express her attitude. Fan Xian couldn't resist sighing and said, "Why don't you all want to go?" The old woman knew he was talking about Donger's family and smiled. Living in Jingdo is not easy. Furthermore, Donger is so close to you. Don't forget, the girls at your side have all been taught by you to have their hearts higher than the sky. They are unyielding and ruthless, and no one is as easy to deal with. Fan Xian started and rubbed his head. He thought that this was indeed the case. Xiaoya, who was still in a manor, was the youngest of those who had followed him. Looking at her mouth, she was also a ruthless and unforgiving character. There was also Xiaoqing, who had brought her man back to the manor to see him a few days ago. Xiaoqing's man was a scholar with scholarly honors. In the end, in front of Xiaoqing, he didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. Xiaoqing and Xiaoya were like this, not to mention Donger and the usually impudent Cici. The girls in the manor had truly been spoiled rotten by him and had been taught badly. Where they were placed, they were all unyielding characters and didn't care about the rules of this world. Although they all appeared gentle on the outside, their hearts were clear. As Fan Xian thought about it, he smiled with some self-satisfaction. Even if he couldn't change much in this world, he had at least changed the thoughts and lives of a few women. It was not bad. Of course, it was only the girls who followed him that could have such benefits. If they didn't have him behind them, with the temper of these four girls, it would probably be difficult for them to move an inch in this world. A night without words. The next day, a piece of news came from Danzhou. It said that the young master of certain manor had been forcefully kicked and spat up a number of bowls of blood. He had urgently found a doctor to save him and was lying in bed moaning. No one had seen the culprit, and Danzhou had always been a simple place with good public order. The people were honest and dutiful, without a trace of banditry. They had never heard of a young master of a noble family being beaten up like this. The entire Danzhou was shocked. The Zhizhou was furious. He was prepared to investigate this case carefully and give the previous teacher a great deal of face. However, when the advisor moved close to his ear and said a few words, the Zhizhou immediately calmed down and returned to his Jingxin, Zhai, to drink tea. The clever people of Danzhou slowly guessed the reason for this matter. No one dared to discuss it too much. The residence of the young master who had been beaten up was filled with hatred and resentment, but he didn't dare to cry out to the rest of the world. Instead, he respectfully sent someone to Dong, Er's courtyard, a hand over the medical fees and compensation for the past 2 years. The matter died down very quickly. The people of Danzhou knew that the young master of the Fan family was not someone who liked to cause trouble. He was just someone who protected his own people, so they were not too worried. After a few more days, a secret edict from Jingdo and a report from Jiangnan were sent at the same time to the Count's manor. Fan Xian lowered his head to look at the 2 thin pieces of paper. He knew that his trip to Danzhou had come to an end. Involuntarily, a glimmer of reluctance welled up in his heart. After all, he was a commissioner of the Overwatch Council and an imperial envoy with full power in Jiangnan Road. Furthermore, he was still young and healthy. He could not follow Chun Pingping and hide away in his favorite place to retire. Although Danzhou was good, he would eventually have to leave. In the morning of the next day, Tung Zijing took Lin Debao and the 3rd prince out to sea to fish again. Fan Xian had finally fulfilled his promise to Wan Er. Holding her little hand, the 2 of them used their slow steps to step on the Danzhou soil. Feeling the atmosphere, they carried out an enriching one-day tour of Danzhou. After a little disguise, the husband and wife went to the lively market, went to the beach by the pier, looked at the beautiful white birds that Hong Chongqing hated bitterly, squatted at the back door of the Count's mansion, and told stories for a while. Only then did they go to the extremely quiet grocery store. Wonder smiled warmly the entire way and allowed her husband to hold her hand as they walked quickly or slowly. She knew that all of these were Fan Xian's most beautiful memories. He had brought her here today in the hope that she could also share in the most gentle and beautiful part of his heart. The grocery store was quiet. The dust was still thick. The couple were both lazy people, so they couldn't be bothered to clean up. They just stood in the room and looked around, talking about old times. Wan Er listened quietly to Fan Xian reminiscing about his childhood with a myriad of emotions. Her heart couldn't help but tremble. She thought that it was not only her life in the royal palace that had been tense and dangerous. Even her husband's childhood, other than happiness, also had many hardships and hardships. Her hand gently held the kitchen knife. Smiling slightly, she said, "Then I will use this knife to cut the shredded radish for you to drink." Fan Xian smiled happily and nodded his head. Wan Er glared at him and said, "Drinking sorghum at such a young age, aren't you afraid of getting drunk to death?" Fan Xian smiled and didn't say anything. Lin Wan suddenly opened her large eyes and said curiously, "Where's the cliff you practice martial arts on? Is it like the steep slope on Song Mountain? Can you take me there to see?" Fan Xian was startled and said, "That place is dangerous. You can't go up." Lin Wan made an "oh" sound, but her round face clearly expressed a strong sense of regret. Fan Xian looked at her and suddenly said, "Hold me tightly." Lin Wan paused for a moment and then chuckled. Her hands passed through Fan Xian's arms and hugged him tightly, just like that night on the bed. She was afraid that he would disappear, and she was even more afraid that he would be immersed in the atmosphere of Danzhou. On the precipitous cliff by the Danzhou Sea, Fan Xian and Lin Wan stood hand in hand on the edge of the cliff. A few steps forward was the abyss, the ocean, and the snowflakes. The sea wind blew against their faces. The sun above their heads seemed a bit further away than it did on the ground. It was clear and scattered with a layer of light, but it did not seem very hot. Wan Er's breathing was slightly chaotic. Her face was flushed, but there was a slight fear in her eyes. Being carried up the cliff by Fan Xian was truly the most exciting experience of her life. She didn't know how she had gotten up those wet and slippery cliffs. So, standing at the edge of the cliff, she was actually not afraid. It was as if she was numb. She timidly glanced at Danzhou in the distance and found that even with her eyesight, she couldn't even see the appearance of the private residences clearly. She turned her head and glanced at the calm Fan Xian. In a quiet voice, she said, "In the past, climbing every day?" "Yes," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "Since I was 6 or 7. I can't remember anymore. In any case, other than me and Uncle, you are the third person to come up here. Lin lowered her head and stuck out her tongue. She knew that this must be Fan Xian's greatest secret, to be able to be brought up by him. A glimmer of sweetness welled up in her heart. Immediately after, there was a glimmer of bitterness. She slowly leaned against Fan Xian's arm and said, I always felt that my life in the royal palace was hard. Only now do I know that your life is even harder than mine. At such a young age, he was forced to climb mountains. What was it for? Naturally, he was worried that someone would come and kill him. To grow up in such a terrifying environment, what kind of torture was that for the boy back then? Thinking of this, Warner felt a glimmer of sympathy for the seemingly incomparably powerful man beside her. Fan Xian smiled slightly and said, What is so hard about it? If you don't want to die, you have to work harder. Actually, compared to other people in this world, you and I are already people who have been soaked in a secret jar. Don't say it's hard lightly. At least we don't have to worry about whether we'll have food to eat, clothes to wear, or whether our parents will sell us to a brothel to be a prostitute or a teapot. Wang listened calmly to the side. The carefree energy on the surface is all faked. Fan Xian looked at the golden light on the surface of the sea in a daze. Actually, you should know that I can be said to be the person who lives the most attentively, the hardest, and the most diligent in this world. Warner nodded. Even during the years in the Tsang Mountains after his marriage, Fan Xian did not forget to cultivate twice a day. Given Fan Xian's present realm and power, he did not need to be so diligent. People often only saw Sir Fan Jr.'s bright and beautiful side. They had no idea how much sweat and effort he had put into this side. I've been like this since I was very young, Fan Xian slowly said. No one understands why I treat myself so harshly. Warner only understood one thing, so she listened quietly to him. Fan Xian paused for a moment and slowly closed his eyes. Facing the Danzhou sea breeze, he quietly said, In reality, the reason is very simple. I don't want to die. I don't want to die. Just like what I often said when I was young. Only when drunk will I know the strength of life. Only after death will I know the weight of life. A person who has never died will never know how terrifying death is. I want to live on in this world, so I have to be ruthless. I have to make myself strong. And you don't know, when you're used to lying on the bed and can't move a finger, even if you want to torture yourself. Suddenly, the heavens give you a chance to torture yourself. You'll be extremely grateful to the heavens, and you'll be intoxicated by it. Fan Xian was intoxicated in the memories of his two lives. Wan, who was by his side, couldn't understand it all. She looked at his delicate and handsome face with a sense of maturity and vicissitudes that completely did not match his age. Her heart was moved and grieved. She felt that her heart followed Fan Xian's heart and surged with an indescribable sorrow. Wan's eyes were slightly wet. With some difficulty, she stood on her tiptoes and gripped the corner of her sleeve to help Fan Xian wipe the corner of his eyes. The trip back to Danzhou to visit relatives ended like this. However, before he left, Fan Xian gathered in the old lady's study and muttered to her for a long time about the news from Jingdou. These two, who appeared to be the most gentle but were actually the coldest, carried out a serious conversation. When he left the study, Fan Xian's expression was slightly heavy. Returning to the room, Warner carefully asked, What happened? Nothing big. Fan Xian thought for a moment and then calmly said, It is natural for the imperial censors to send a letter. I am an imperial envoy of Jiangnan Road. Running to Danzhou to play is certainly an eyesore to many people. More importantly, I heard some news that is not very comfortable. What news? Warner saw a rare glimmer of annoyance appear on her husband's face and couldn't resist smiling. To be able to make you lose your composure. Fan Xian sighed and forced a smile. During the new year, Yin Xiaoi will also be returning to the capital to report on his work. He will probably be entering the capital at about the same time as me. Yin Xiaoi? The Qin Kingdom's northern governor, the former commander of the imperial army, and a famous 9th-level super ace in the Qin Kingdom. Most importantly, he was the eldest princess' trusted aide and had a reputation in the military. Even the emperor would not rashly suppress him without evidence. When such a figure returned to the capital, it was inevitable that he would directly come into contact with Fan Xian. Fan Xian still remembered the shocking arrow he had encountered when he had snuck into the royal palace. One furrowed her brows and said, "Is the martial conference in front of the palace going to resume?" Fan Xian glanced at her in shock. Shortly after, he smiled and patted her head. He thought to himself that his wife's sense of smell was indeed sharp in this area. Nodding his head, he said, "I heard it is the Bureau of Military Affairs Intention. The military has suggested resuming the martial conference to raise the morale of the people." "What did the emperor say?" Warner asked worriedly. She knew that the Qin kingdom was a country that conquered the world on horseback and had always placed great importance on military achievements. However, after 3 northern expeditions, the emperor had recuperated in preparation for another battle. He had turned his gaze to governance and stopped the most important annual martial conference many years ago. "Naturally, the emperor will not object," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "This is a good thing. The court has been in peace for too long. Even the Jiaozhou Navy has changed. Naturally, they need a reason to rally the military's morale." Lin Wana was silent for a moment and then suddenly said, "I'm afraid it is targeted at you." "I am a civil official," Fan Xian said with a smile, but he clearly felt a problem in his heart. His view was different from that of the second prince on Lu Jing River. The second prince always thought that the emperor had Fan Xian handle the Jiaozhou Navy matter because he had loosened his mouth to let Fan Xian come into contact with and familiarize himself with military affairs. However, Fan Xian thought that his unyielding father was thinking the opposite problem. He had killed Chang Kuan and secretly harmed Deng Xiaobo. Regardless of the faction in the military, the commanders and generals probably all held a grudge against him. The emperor still did not want the commissioner of the Overwatch Council to gently touch military power. Warner looked at him and sighed. "You are a civil official, but you are also a martial ace known to all under heaven." Fan Xian's eyebrows rose. "You mean that Yin Xiaoyi will challenge me in the martial conference when he returns to the capital?" The people of the Qin kingdom loved martial arts. Although this trend had gradually faded, the valiant taste deeply rooted in the hearts of the people and officials could not be brushed away. Just like how Yi Ling could throw a knife outside the royal palace to challenge Fan Xian, duels were still legal matters in the Qin kingdom. Furthermore, no one was willing to back out of a martial conference in front of the palace. However, Fan Xian was willing to back out. He smiled coldly and said, "How childish. He wants to fight me, so I have to fight him?" In his heart, martial arts were used to kill people and not to fight in duels. If he wanted to kill people, Fan Xian had countless methods that were more efficient and safer than a duel. Duel? A child's game. Fan Xian suddenly felt that the Qin kingdom's military was somewhat childish. He couldn't help but snort disdainfully. Warner sighed and gently said, "Although this method is direct and effective, it is very stupid. Mother shouldn't be so stupid as to have Yin Xiaoyi challenge you in the palace. Regardless of whether he wins or loses, Yin Xiaoyi wouldn't dare to actually hurt you. The emperor's eyes are watching. Thus, I also feel that I cannot understand the reasoning behind this. Perhaps we are thinking the wrong way. Yin Xiaoyi is the governor of the north. He hasn't returned to the capital in 2 years, so he should be reporting on his work." Fan Xian suddenly had a thought. He furrowed his brows. If Yin Xiaoyi's return to the capital this time had something to do with the so-called martial conference, then it could only mean one thing. The power in the court was finally trying to directly challenge the authority of the royal family. But what right did the eldest princess have? "If I avoid the battle, it will weaken the momentum," Fan Xian said with a slight smile. "But, I don't care about this face." This was a lie. Fan Xian was also a vain person. If it was another important military general challenging Fan Xian in the martial conference, Fan Xian wouldn't even blink. He would directly beat the other person until even their mother wouldn't recognize them and add a golden border to his reputation. But that person was Yin Xiaoyi. Fan Xian asked himself honestly, Even though his injuries had long healed, and he had the help of Haitong's heart of Tianyi Dao, and he had long stood firmly at the peak of the 9th level, if he were to truly face a super warrior who could shock the world with one arrow, he still wouldn't have it easy. On his side, there were two people who could stand against Yin Xiaoyi, Haidang, and the Shadow. The problem was, these two could not act for him. On his side, there was still one person who could easily finish off Yin Xiaoyi and Uncle Wu Zhu. The problem was, Uncle Wu Zhu had once again left home. Amidst Fan Xian's nervousness, he suddenly and inexplicably became excited. The tip of his nose seemed to smell the salty and wet smell of the sea cliff. If, after returning to the capital, he truly had to fight Yin Xiaoyi head-on, if he didn't rely on those little tricks, just how far could he go? Jingdo, wind and thunder, warriors, martial arts. These words tempted Fan Xian's restless heart. He was silent for a moment. Suddenly, he raised his head and smiled. Gently, he said, "I won't fight, but how about trying to kill him?" Warner opened her eyes wide and was speechless for a moment. "I am about to leave Danzhou. I know some friends feel that this section is a bit long, but before I entered Danzhou, I said in advance that this is a section that I think is very important. I will write it in great detail. Fan Xian's return to Danzhou is the content I passionately hoped for when I wrote the first volume. After looking forward to it for almost a year, I have finally come back. How can I not miss it? How can I not put my heart into it? If I don't write about Dong, I will slap myself, haha." Also, when writing a novel online, it is actually very difficult to write about the main character's personality, 3 views, and the like in large chunks. It can only be reflected through small details in different chapters. This is a very complicated matter, so I need the Danzhou section. These chapters are to help this novel stand out, and also to satisfy my own interests and aesthetic inclinations. Although they may not be very powerful, I still have to write. No, writing is so tiring. If I wanted to twist the plot, I would certainly write much faster, and I would also earn more money. It is only a problem of rhythm. I'm still learning. The rhythm of a popular novel fluctuates. This is a very difficult problem. There is no trick to it. I can only master it the more I write, the better I get. I hope that in my future writing career, I can reach a certain level. I hope everyone can see me continue to improve. Finally, I very sincerely ask everyone to vote for me. This is the middle of the month, and I really need everyone's monthly votes. Those who love Dong please give me a monthly vote. Those who love please give me a monthly vote. Those who love Dong please give me a monthly vote. Those who love Yin Xiaoyi also have to give me a monthly vote. Writing a book needs to be very sincere, and canvassing for votes also needs to be very sincere. Just like yesterday, a reader in the book review remembered a joke from many months ago. Diarrhea, but don't forget to canvass for votes. I have said so much very seriously. Everyone is not allowed to laugh. Just give me a monthly vote. To be continued. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 439. On a winter day in the 6th year of the Qin calendar, the gloomy dusk sun shone through from the distant Song Mountains. The weather was very cold. The private residences in the wilderness were all white. It was snow. The clouds gradually thickened and swallowed the gloomy sun into darkness. The wind also gradually grew stronger, picking up the accumulated snow on the ground and sending it dancing in the air. More snow fell from the sky. Snowflakes of different colors from different places used the power of the wind to tangle together. In the oppressive air, they twisted and turned their heads, displaying different levels of whiteness and coldness. The wind and snow rose again. The people hurrying on the road were unspeakably miserable. They all searched for the nearest cottage or inn to rest. This year, there had been no floods in the Qin kingdom, but the snowfall was not small. Fortunately, during the summer, the disaster relief in the Jiangnan counties had gone unusually smoothly. The affected people had a place to stay, so the chances of them freezing to death were much lower. This was Yingzhou, the province that had suffered the most from the floods. It was also the place where the bandits were the most ferocious after the disaster. However, ever since the imperial envoy Fan Xian had come to Jiangnan, the bandits in Yingzhou had become much more well-behaved, perhaps because they were afraid of the might of heaven or the legendary methods of Sir Fan Jr. They had already disappeared for a long time. It was because of this that there were travelers who dared to walk on the road in this snowy day. However, now that the man-made disaster had passed, the heavens did not give them any face. Although the Yangtze River had not been sealed, not many people were willing to brave the harsh cold and walk in the direction of Jingdou, other than the group of carriages that were all black. The windows and lower edges of the carriages were sealed very well. Not a sliver of cold air could penetrate. However, the thick cotton curtains in front of the carriage blocked the attack of the wind and snow. Occasionally, they gave out a few muffled cries of sorrow. There was a heater in the carriage. A gust of hot air followed the fragrance and rose into the air, making the carriage as warm as spring. It formed a clear contrast with the harsh cold outside. Fan Xian felt a little hot. He put 2 fingers on his right hand to his neck and loosened the buttons on his fur coat, exposing his neck. He took 2 deep breaths and put down the file in his hands. He squinted and looked out of the carriage. Outside the carriage was a vast expanse of whiteness. The houses of Songshan village, the winter fields and ponds were all covered in snow, frozen into ice mirrors. The scene of the flood that they saw when they passed by this place in the past was no longer visible. The people who died in the flood had long been buried. Perhaps their white bones were still trembling in the depths of the snow. In the distance was a row of simple and crude houses. It could be seen that the materials used to build them were not very sturdy and could not keep out the cold. Looking at the spots of firelight and warmth seeping out from inside, Fan Xian nodded his head with satisfaction. As long as there was firewood for the stove, it was fine. Although the commoners lived hard lives, they could endure it. A little warmth could protect them through this harsh winter. Let's find a place to rest. Fan Xian looked at the snow-covered Overwatch Council carriage driver outside the carriage and couldn't resist furrowing his brows. Although it is important to hurry, don't get sick from the cold. Yes, sir. The group of carriages slowly made a turn and drove along the widest ridge toward the neighboring village. Fan Xian was returning to Jingdou to report on his work. The court had set the date of his return there. Who knew that they would run into the heaviest snowfall in years and be delayed in Shazhou for a few days? Time suddenly became tight. Thus, the subordinates of the Overwatch Council followed his wishes and changed carriages in Shazhou to travel along the road against the wind and snow. When they entered the village, a local Li Zheng had already rushed over to welcome them. This Li Zheng had his hands in a thick cotton-padded jacket, curiously and fearfully looking at the black motorcade. He was wondering which important person would travel in this windy and snowy weather. Naturally, there were Overwatch Council officials who went to negotiate with him. Fan Xian didn't want to disturb the place too much, so he traveled stealthily the entire way. He got off the carriage and felt the snowflakes follow the cold wind into his collar. Unconsciously, he tightened his buckles and walked toward the village with the silver-white fox fur cloak. Hong Chongqing led a few swordsmen of the 6th Bureau and followed silently behind him. Fan Xian glanced out of the corner of his eye and thought of Wan who was still busy in Jiangnan. The 3rd prince had already returned to the capital a month earlier. In order to ensure his wife's safety, he had left Gao De and the other 7 Tiger Guards in Hangzhou. When they left Danzhou, it was early autumn. Fan Xian and his group first returned to Hangzhou. These few months were mainly used to clean out the remnants of the Juanshan Conference in Jiangnan, as well as other matters. The matter they had agreed on in Danzhou had been approved by the palace. Warner had taken a lead. The matter had developed unexpectedly smoothly. The Xiong family of Lingnan and the Sun family of Chuanzhou had both invested a large sum of silver into the conference. Even the Ming family, which was like a declining mountain, had shown some interest. However, Wer still hadn't thought of a name for this organization or its true use, so she had first taken a name of the Hangzhou Conference and made do with it. With the support of Silver and Fan Xian's connections, The Hangzhou Conference could easily purchase northern cheese grain ahead of time. It could easily connect with the various provinces without worrying about the government finding trouble. Additionally, with the connections of the Fan, Liu, and Lin families all over the world, as well as Xia Qifei's Jiang and water bandits channeled deep into the people, the Hangzhou Conference developed quickly. The entire Jiangnan disaster relief work, other than the Quartz Channel, had another smooth and speedy channel. However, Fan Xian and Wanda had always been hidden behind the scenes. Not many people knew the role this couple played in the Hangzhou Conference. They all thought that this matter was led by nobles in the palace in Jingdou, and the palace treasury transport company Yamen was a tool. There was another heavy snowfall in Jiangnan this winter. Who knew how many families would run out of food, how many farmhouses would be crushed, and how many people would freeze to death? Lin Wana had to stay in Hangzhou for a while. At least, she had to help the Jiangnan people get through this period of time before anything else. It was still the same old saying. Even if she couldn't help much, it was better than nothing. Lin Wana busied herself in this matter. Her talent for strategy, which had long been helplessly suppressed, finally revealed a corner. Fan Xian did not put too much effort into this matter. It was just his wife alone using letters to control all aspects. Whether coldly, majestically, or gently, she controlled this strange beast. She carefully had it plow the field for the people under heaven, yet she did not make the government, the driver, feel unhappy. However, this matter was somewhat arduous. The degree of propriety and triviality made even Fan Xian fear it like a tiger. Warner had finally found something that could prove herself. How could she let go so easily? Thus, she worked tirelessly. When Fan Xian left Hangzhou, he was worried that she would not be able to take good care of herself. The wife of the Tung family was also a servant who deeply feared the mistress, so he decided to leave Cece there. As Fan Xian thought about this, he quickly walked into the village. The carriage had already been set up. He left behind people to guard the place. All of his subordinates, a total of 30 or so people, followed him into the village and entered the almost empty family school. Li Zheng carefully followed behind. He did not dare ask who this important figure wearing the expensive fox fur coat was. He could only guess endlessly in his heart. After entering the empty family school, someone had already started a stove. After the ginger and sugar water was cooked, the women in the village hurriedly poured it into bowls and respectfully presented it to the officials. Fan Xian picked it up and took a sip. He didn't say anything. His clear and spirited eyes only stared in a daze at the row of houses outside the main door. He suddenly opened his mouth and asked, "If the snow gets heavier, will these houses be able to hold up?" This village was still in Yingzhou. It was also a pitiful place that had been hit by a flood last year. This row of houses had been gradually built last year. They looked thin, so Fan Xian was a bit worried. Li Zheng paused. He wasn't sure if this person was asking him. Hong Changqing coughed and gave him a meaningful glance. Only now did Li Zheng wake up. His half-bent body moved a few steps closer to Fan Xian and respectfully replied, "Master, in a few days, the snow will be even thicker. Whether or not it will be able to hold up, I'm really not sure." Fan Xian glanced at him with some surprise. He thought it was rare for a mere Li Zheng to not keep on boasting. He smiled warmly and said, "Then, won't you have to patrol every day?" Li Zheng chuckled and said, "Master, what are you talking about? With such heavy snow, as Li Zheng, of course, I have to look at it every day." He then proudly said, "However, I think it shouldn't be a problem. Don't look at these houses as unremarkable. They were designed by the master craftsmen of the palace treasury. I heard that the 3 large workshops all live in these kinds of houses. The snow should be fine." Fan Xian began to laugh. His subordinates behind him also began to laugh. Li Zheng was a bit confused. He thought, what is so funny? He asked a few more questions about whether there was enough firewood and briquettes. Fan Xian then ended his conversation with Li Zheng. Involuntarily, a complicated emotion welled up in his heart. The power of the Qing kingdom was indeed powerful. As long as it was operated properly, it would not be a problem to ensure these commoners a normal life. As for himself, He seemed to be gradually getting used to the feeling of being a powerful official. Although he was just passing by, he couldn't resist asking a few more questions. Powerful official? Fan Xian sighed and walked to the door of the school. Narrowing his eyes, he looked at the darkening sky outside, the colder wind, the heavier and heavier snow, and the deeper and deeper cold. His thoughts floated to another place. The first time he thought he should be a powerful official in this life was when he said it to his father. The second time was when he was drunk in Shangjing in northern Qi. Haitang left. When Lang Qiao brought the northern Qi diplomatic group to Suzhou, Fan Xian knew that Haitang would certainly follow her brother disciple back to northern Qi. For one, it was the northern Qi Empress Dowager's edict. For another, Haitang couldn't find any excuse to convince herself to stay. She was the saint girl of northern Qi, not the Qing kingdom's princess. What right did she have to live in the Fan family's Hua garden every day? Furthermore, her most important mission in coming south was to help the northern Qi emperor monitor Fan Xian's performance of the secret agreement. Given her relationship with Fan Xian, it seemed that even the northern Qi emperor had a headache. Naturally, he would follow the Empress Dowager's wishes and summon this disciple aunt back. Fan Xian did not see that scene with his own eyes, but it was as if he could always see it in his mind. That flowery dress, that village girl, swaying her body, carrying a basket, and leaving Suzhou at ease. She didn't even turn her head to look. Although Haitang had left, Fan Xian's agreement with northern Qi continued to progress steadily. The smuggling along the North Road had already entered a stable stage under Fan Xizha and Xia Qifei's North and South cooperation. The channels between the two sides had already been opened. Goods produced by the palace treasury flowed endlessly into northern Qi territory. The price was much cheaper than on the market. The Qing court had lost a great deal of silver because of Fan Xian's secret mischief, but the Hangzhou conference had gained a great deal of silver. It was all the people's silver. Who cared who was holding it and who was using it? Under Fan Xian's attack, the Ming family had truly sunk into a stalemate. Although the Ming family still had tens of millions of liang of silver in their hands, assets were not flowing water. The Ming family could not bear to sell off their land and property to make their business more active. Thus, they could only borrow money from outside to move things around. The problem was that the old Ming matriarch had been strangled to death by Ming Qingda. This master of the Ming family did not have time to completely accept the old matriarch's position in the Juanshan conference. Although Dongyi's Taiping money house still supported the Ming family, it was clearly much weaker. Thus, Ming Qingda could only go to find the person who had lent him a helping hand during his time of great trouble. Zhaoshang money house. Fan Xian stood at the door with his head lowered. The more he borrowed, the better. He had to follow the emperor's wishes and take everything the Ming family had without bloodshed. That was why he had dragged things out for so long. He raised his head and looked at the heavy snow in front of him. His heart was filled with satisfaction and pride. He had been proud of himself for so many years, but to be able to settle Jiangnan, he had to allow himself a chance to be proud. Suddenly, his pupils constricted abruptly. In the heavy snow, a black line broke through the wind. Like a streak of black lightning, it seemed to have already crossed the distance between time and space. Using the wind and snow to cover the sound of breaking through the air, it came in front of him in an instant. It was an arrow, a black arrow. Fan Xian narrowed his eyes and did not dodge or avoid it. The tyrannical Jinshi in his body suddenly rose. His left hand moved, and the long sword at his waist swung up. The tip of the sword chopped straight forward. There was a muffled thud. Fan Xian's seemingly simple but actually ruthless strike struck empty air. A green banner suddenly appeared in front of him. Under the banner was a green-clothed man with a green cloth band tied to his hair. The soul-eating arrow landed on the pole in the middle of the banner. The feathers of the arrow trembled endlessly. He saw two large words written on the banner. Tai Xiang. The secret agents of the Overwatch Council had long reacted. 6 swordsmen held hard crossbows and surrounded the green-clothed man in the center. The other 6th Bureau swordsman had already followed the snowflakes in the dark night toward where the arrow had come from and disappeared into the darkness. Fan Xian looked at the green-clothed man. His gaze was calm. No one knew what he was thinking. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and said, "Return." With one simple word, all of the 6th Bureau swordsmen who had snuck out to chase after the archer obeyed the order and stood silently on the snowy plain in front of the school, surrounding the green-clothed man in the center. Fan Xian raised his head and glanced at the green banner. Suddenly, he said, "Fortune teller, did you calculate that someone was coming to assassinate me?" The green-clothed man lowered his head. His face could not be seen clearly. He only smiled slightly and said, "How could a mere little arrow hurt Sir Fan Jr.?" Fan Xian calmly said, "That is why I do not understand. The big arrow did not move. So how did the little arrow come?" The green-clothed man warmly said, "The little arrow is young and has a fiery temper. He is always a bit impulsive." Fan Xian was silent. The green-clothed man continued, "I'm also not a fortune teller." He put 2 fingers together and pointed at the 2 words on the banner in his hand. "My surname is Tai, and my name is Xiang. Yesterday's canvassing for votes was very effective, very good. Continue canvassing for monthly votes. Vote for me, vote for me. If you want to know what happens next, please log on to www.cmfu.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.